A beautiful image of an angel girl holding a strange bluish sphere appeared before the users. People stopped in bewilderment, and only with open eyes looked in the direction of the creature. It was an unexpected event. No devices were working, the phone service was not there, people started to panic. Something very unusual was happening. The strange angel said they didn't need to be so wary, all because the demon lord had risen. They were summoned to this world only to save a fantasy that is in grave danger. The rest of us are even more wary. The woman introduced herself as a goddess. A slight smile appeared, and she looked at the others involved with warmth in her eyes. Everyone continued to panic, and only one guy stood and listened with interest to everything said. He tried to comprehend. The goddess said they would soon move to the Temple of Fantasy. This structure was like the Greek pantheon of myths and legends. The goddess said they would be met there by a saint who had received her blessing. The girl sat in front of the statue and prayed. She had to provide first aid and support to the arrivals to bring them up to speed so they wouldn't be so scared. One of those who came raised his hand and asked permission to ask a question. The goddess gladly told them to ask anything. This guy's name was Ohanu. He asked if there were skill status window levels in monsters like in other games. After the goddess nodded in the affirmative, a couple of people got excited. Great, so this would be much easier than it turned out to be. The next girl, named Jang Myeon, smiled and said that if it's a fantasy world, then it has a medieval setting, like in the short stories. And to this, the goddess answered in the affirmative. This gave another reason for joy. Another guy raised his hand and said he wanted to ask a question. This person's name was Choi Kangmin. With a serious look at the goddess, he asked if the one who would win in this world would become a hero. After the goddess answered, no, Kangmin asked, then turns out they are all heroes here, without exception. The goddess nodded. But not everyone here is endowed with equal power. Everyone will have their own abilities. Only after being recognized and blessed by the gods can they become true, full-fledged heroes. The woman closed her eyes. Smiling Kangmin thanked the angel girl for the answer. It was completely fine with him. Seeing the relationship of the goddess to this guy, the others began to look at him after all. Even such creatures like beautiful. Another girl raised her hand and asked for the opportunity to ask a question, goddess, and to this she answered. In the affirmative, she was ready to answer anything. The girl's name was Yu Bora. She introduced herself and said that she was the class president. There was clearly excitement and worry on her face. Smiling with the same friendly smile, the goddess asked, "So what was her question?" The atmosphere here was favorable. Bora Said. Because of their sudden disappearance, everyone must be very concerned about whether the contestants will be able to contact them at least someday. For a second, there was a tense silence, as if the goddess was searching for the right answer. It seemed that this question had put her in a stupor. After a bit of thought, the angel replied that that would be problematic. Everyone started to worry, then how could they get back from here? Undeterred, the woman replied that if they defeated the demon lord, the gods who had given them the blessing would grant their wish. Immediately, everyone started shouting that they had a question, and there was so much shouting that it was hard to distinguish anyone's voice. Everyone had something to ask. So many people wanted to ask that they crowded together in a single crowd. The goddess looked down on them. A smile spread across her face. She'd seen these characters many times before, and it was even slightly amusing. In the middle of this crowd stood only one guy who had been silent all this time, and listening to every word, he was clearly worried inside. Still gathering his thoughts, he raised his hand and in a timid voice apologized and wanted to ask a question. And this time, the goddess smiled and allowed him to ask. There was a peaceful expression on the girl's face. It was more of a request than a question. The guy looked at the angel and asked to be sent back to Earth. He was uncomfortable here. The goddess laughed and said that she had told them before that if they defeated the demon lord, the wish would be granted. In a trembling voice, the boy kept trying to explain everything. He was very scared, and tears came to his eyes. But since he has no interest in becoming a hero and just wants to return to Earth to his family, he asked, so. After a little thought, the player was even more frightened. Only, let them not tell him that it is impossible to return to Earth. But no, it is possible. Only the goddess wanted to ask a question. A world with many lives, on the verge of collapse, they demand help. So why do these people turn a blind eye to such an impressive-looking disaster where the demon lord is ruled by a true monster? However, the kid was not going to give up. Did he really need to save the world that makes his family worry? He did not give up trying to return. Bora, who was standing next to him, looked at him with a surprised look. She had something to say. This guy seemed very strange to her. The goddess flew over to this strange guy and asked him what his own name was. The player shivered a little. The child introduced himself. He said his name was Kang Hansu. The goddess flew up to him and lightly took his face with the palm of her hand. Everyone else fell silent. The goddess said that those who are not interested in becoming a hero like this guy, let them give their names now. She said she wouldn't push them, but everyone was silent and looking at each other, waiting to see what would happen. Kang opened his eyes and was very much afraid. He hadn't expected such a reaction and was expecting the worst. Exodus had goosebumps running down his back. No one ever volunteered. Now a portal to some other dimension opened in front of him. Khan stood in front of it and trembled with fear. The goddess turned to the boy and said he didn't fit in this place for great heroes performing feats. Khan only remained silent. As soon as the guy approached the portal, everyone started asking him to say hi to their parents. Behind him there was a lot of shouting. With a smile at the thought of it, Khan looked at them and thought he would tell them that they had terrible sons and daughters and jumped into the portal. The first place he found himself was some kind of strange forest similar to Earth's, but it was too early to draw conclusions. Looking around hopefully, Kang pondered where he was. It had to be Earth, after all. He shouldn't be far from the school, but suddenly there was a strange sound and heavy footsteps behind him. Happy to be home at last, Khan turned his head and wanted to ask for directions, but the words stuck in his throat. The first thing he saw was the horrible face of a dog-like monster with burning eyes. The monster snarled at him. Along with this werewolf were several others holding strange elf-like creatures. One of the elven women seemed to be on the other side of the world, or unconscious. Her eyes were shrouded in a white film. He was supposed to be at home on Earth, but this doesn't look like Earth to me. Several of the same werewolves looked hungrily at the poor kid. A second more, and they broke away from the place, running straight after him. The unfortunate one, with screams and lack of understanding of the situation, was saving his life. The events moved to the City of Saints. There was a huge fortress of the goddess, where the most important events took place. A second later, a vague ray of light flew into the central building of the temple and pierced the roof, and a slight rumble was heard. All the participants who were brought into this world squinted and tried to stand on their feet. There was a strong wind. People did not understand what was happening. Hanu opened his arms and tried to steady himself. He squinted to look in front of him. The guy heard someone's pleasant voice. The same saint girl with long ash-colored hair greeted everyone present with a warm and soothing voice. Next to her stood another knight, most likely a guard, and the girl looked at those present with enlightened eyes and goodwill. On the other side stood another man with white hair. Everyone immediately took notice of him. He was incredibly handsome. The saint first began to speak. She said that having received a blessing from her goddess, she was looking forward to the meeting. That same man with white hair bore the name Alsus. He was a sword master of the highest-ranked prince of the kingdom and the hero's swordsmanship instructor. All the girls who were here immediately almost fainted from such a beauty, and guys just looked at him with disbelief. The saint looked in the direction where the two maids were standing and said that the princess was late. Two old ladies nearby shivered. Suddenly the doors opened and a girl with pink hair and a dress appeared on the doorstep. She screamed that she had been drinking too much, so she was late. Turning to the princess, whose name was Athena the saint, said that her honesty was both a strength and a weakness. Guiltily looking at the others, Athena slipped and fell. The floor in this temple was very slippery. The girl looked up and saw everyone present looking at her with surprise and even some fear. As suddenly, after a brief pause, everyone marveled at how cute the princess was, and the girl smiled even wider. The saint explained that this girl is the princess of the Archmage Kingdom. South of the temple, she will support them along with the prince. Suddenly, one of the players smiled. Finally, the status window appeared just like in the games he was used to playing. Hanu looked at everyone else with contempt. They were like little kids. How can a guy think he's better than everyone else? First, it was necessary to check the hero indicated in the divisions of the blessing. Hanu looked closely and jabbed his finger forward. Seeing the infinite experience boost, the guy took a closer look. Closer would be a real cheat. But too many competitors received the same blessing. For example, Kangman, he immediately disliked Hanu. By looking at the others to receive the blessing, they must win God's favor. Everyone will have the opportunity to do so. Immediately, status windows began to appear in front of the others, as people stared in amazement in front of them and studied their new abilities. Meanwhile, the saint continued to explain each god will have their own standards, but they are all looking for someone to overthrow the great demon lord. With a smile, Kangman looked at the others quite well. The guy already felt that he could handle this task with ease. The saint reminded them that the gods, though watching over the heroes, but their attention is not eternal. She prayed that everyone could receive divine blessing. Suddenly, one of the group, the guy with glasses, raised his hand and asked what to do if they didn't get anything. The guy was visibly nervous, but Saint smiled and asked herself, should she bother with such garbage? A smile continued to shine on her face. The unfortunate man lowered his hand and somehow shriveled up. He hadn't expected such a reaction, refused a friendly goddess. So our heroes appeared in a fantasy world, filled with dreams and hopes. All of them were ready. The adventure began. Meanwhile, the unfortunate Hansu, who was sent to the dark forest, was trying to escape from these monsters. His breathing was almost knocked out. The guy had only run a few dozen meters and was already exhausted, leaning on a tree trunk and breathing heavily. Suddenly, something flew near him and stuck into the trunk. The poor man looked around in horror. It was a huge arrow. The barking sounds of these monsters could be heard from afar. They called the kid meat and tried to catch him and eat him. It doesn't take a genius to realize that such animals don't exist on the planet. It's a real mockery. It was only now that the poor man realized that that person calling herself a goddess had tricked him and wasn't going to send him back. Of course, he should have known sooner. He stood leaning against a tree and tried to gather his thoughts. Everything was too fast and unexpected. The frightened boy could already hear behind his back. These monstrous creatures, wanting to savor his flesh, needed to flee. He immediately rushed onward. If this was a fantasy world, then maybe there would be some magic or something. A status window immediately appeared in front of him, and Hansu began to study his characteristics. So far, they were unimpressive, to say the least. Most likely the gods did it on purpose to get rid of him as soon as possible. It was just hopeless. Hope was almost gone. The boy continued to run, and behind him, he could still hear the screams of those monsters, and for a moment, he thought about whether he could communicate with them. When the man approached them and asked to speak, the monsters stopped for a second and looked amongst themselves, breathing heavily. But after they kept calling him meat, Hansu realized it was just useless. He covered his ears and ran on. After a few meters, his strength had completely left him. The unfortunate man could no longer run, but only resign himself to his fate. The boy prayed it would be quick and as painless as possible. The monsters were already reaching for him with their clawed paws. Suddenly something whistled nearby, and the player felt something stabbed into his leg. He lowered his eyes and noticed that it was an arrow. Unbearable pain burned through his entire body and his eyes. Even more fear just wasn't enough. Looking up in front of him, the already frightened guy noticed several elf-like creatures. Most likely they were the ones shooting. One elfess drew the bowstring and shouted something in a frightened voice, but her words were unintelligible. Hansu fell to the ground in pain. He didn't understand anything. But one thing was clear. Danger still haunted him. The monsters also noticed the elves and started screaming. They saw a new prey, I think for a second, forgot about the wounded, had a chance to escape. Seizing the opportunity, Hansu crawled over to the nearest tree and leaned on what he could do now. Pray to God. No, it was the goddess's fault. He held on to the arrow and tried to pull it out, but felt nothing but the pain of hell. At this moment, someone was already following him from the side of the tree. Some incomprehensible translucent hooded silhouette was already following him. Already resigned to his sad fate, the guy only thought how to accept his end faster and breathed heavily, and a certain god was peeping at him. Still sitting and watching the animal rampage, Hansu tried to think of any option to survive. He was still staring at the arrow stuck in his leg and agonized with unbearable pain and hopelessness. Instead of praying to God or trying to save his life, this man just decided to accept his demise and go to the other world. But a certain god, translucent, hooded creature began peeping at the guy now in the open. He looked at what was happening with surprised eyes. Although they were not visible behind his thick purple bangs, God was very interested. I don't know what he should do anymore, Hansu. Just cried bitter tears and asked at least some god to save him. Silhouette approached the boy even faster. His body reacted instinctively faster than his mind. The creature stood close and with uncomprehending eyes looked at the strange fellow who was agonizing and fighting for life with all his might. He cried and begged this god to save him in some way. He was in agony and had already lost all hope of salvation. The boy heard the creature start to mutter something about there being no other gods. Hansu fell silent. After thinking for a few seconds, the player asked, did this god-outsider creature not understand the meaning of the word, and began to think. God continued to ponder, and the player tried to explain, an outsider is a term denoting people who are outside of social groups. But the player put it a little differently. He decided to spice it up, kind of lone wolf running in the wilderness. God seems to like it. Hansu exhaled a breath. No god liked the meaning of that word well, or at least the way he heard it. And now this creature was claiming to be a true outsider. This god had a proud look on his face, and it seemed to work just fine. In any case, the player asked to be saved. At least somehow, he was already willing to do anything to stay alive. With a smile on his face, God asked if the guy was also an outsider. This creature was acting like a child. Surprised by this turn of events, Hansu didn't realize at first what he was talking about. It's not a good situation to give each other a nickname. Thinking back on his past, the player realized he only ended up that way because his classmates were horrible sons and daughters. He's definitely not an outsider. With a trembling voice, Hansu pointed his finger at himself and decided that it was better to agree with this god, since his life depended on it. While the god was thinking about whether to help the guy or not, the monsters were already approaching. Eventually, the player lowered his eyes and apologized for an outsider. It's normal for an outsider to help another, but it doesn't apply to this creature, since he is God. However, the creature said that all outsiders are the same. He seemed to be confused and pondered what he should do. But suddenly, the ghost raised his hand and a bright green light poured out of it. It seems everything worked and the player will live. The arrow that was sticking in his leg began to glow, and the pain went away almost instantly. He felt an incredible relief in his whole body, as if he had been reborn, but it was all a little strange, especially from a normal person. In his haste to get to his feet, Hansu wanted to thank God, but suddenly felt his whole body become lighter. Hiding behind a tree, the player tried to get out of sight of the monsters until they spotted him. God emphasized that she would only help an outsider. The player didn't really have any complaints, and the guy hurried away from here before the monster finally noticed him. One of the monsters kept yelling about meat. At least talking to them would be a bad idea, even when Hansu understood their words. Suddenly, a branch cracked under his feet, and the monsters heard his player run away from here, and the monsters repeated his words about the conversation. The huge jackal rushed at him and stretched his clawed paw forward a couple more centimeters, and the guy was finished. During his escape, Hansu finally realized that he had received this blessing from God, after all, thanks to calling himself an outsider. By that time, the monsters were already exhausted and could not keep up with the boy who had gained strength. But the happiness was not so long. Suddenly, in the back of the player flew a powerful stone, and a crack was heard. But fortunately, Hansu did not fall. The monsters wondered why their prey was so fast and did not fall after hitting the stone. But the player, meanwhile, accelerated. Next to him was the same god. Hansu enthusiastically said that this is just amazing. And it's not just empty words, but completely seriously. Continuing to run, the player thought, if they caught him, should he just bite his tongue, though? With his approach to things, it was unlikely. After running a few meters, he stopped on a cliff. The pit was very deep, and at the bottom lay the soul of one of the animals, who had not been lucky enough to fall. A nightmarish sight the guy started to resent. It was inhuman. It would have been better to give him wings or something like that, rather than a temporary immortality. In the meantime, the pack of monsters was already approaching, and their vile voices were heard, rejoicing that their prey would not be able to escape. At that moment, Hansu realized that while he was arguing with this god, there was an abyss in front of him and monsters behind him. Pausing for a second, the player began to think whether he should even jump in there. The prospect of crashing is certainly depressing, but what choice does he have? After a second, it was decided. Hansu turned around and started to improvise. The guy yelled for them all to finally stop. The monsters looked at him in surprise, but still continued to lick. The player said that they were hungry, but there was not much to eat. Hansu smiled and said that whoever caught him first would get the most delicious body parts, and he would give them to him. For a second, there was silence between them. The monsters looked at him with surprised looks, but still they dared to approach. A smile appeared on the boy's face as the plan seemed to work. The monsters took the bait. And indeed, the werewolves were approaching at an incredible speed, each of them wanting to grab the most tidbits. They pulled their clawed paws, and Hansu veered backward and tried to jump straight into the abyss. One paw had already grabbed the boy's shoulder, and the other by his throat. The monsters were pulling him toward them, each wanting to get their prey. Suddenly, a thought came to mind, and the player grabbed the shoulder of one of the monsters, pulling it towards him. There was a screech, and he and the rest of the monsters fell straight into the deep abyss, and only now did the monsters realize that they had been tricked. The bodies of those dogs cushioned the fall a bit, but Hansu still felt the impact. A second later, the boy was already lying on the floor. Standing up and shaking himself off, Hansu responded to his patron's admiration by saying that there was nothing special about it, so let him not be surprised. But it turned out that one of the monsters was still alive. He pulled out a small dagger and pounced on the boy in order to finally catch him. It was a monster called the Butcher of the Blue Moon. The jackal who had managed to survive was now reaching for the boy, waving his blade. Taking a closer look, the player realized that this monster had only survived due to its high level, even without having a blessing. On the other hand, killing such a monster would give a lot of experience, so Hansu picked up the nearest rock and swung it around. Somewhere in the temple there was a statue of the goddess, and the voice of the saint was heard explaining the basics. Her voice sounded like music. The woman walked around in the middle of the newcomers who were listening to her with their mouths open, saying that the level and the blessing were the main parts of the game. While everyone was taking notes and listening attentively to the lecture, Hanu was sitting somewhere nearby and yawning. Nearby, the seated Kangman begged God to give him his blessing. He is the talented disciple who will conquer this world. Suddenly Bora raised her hand. She asked if all this meant that the gods would watch over them all the time. Saint nodded her head. Yes, it would. Hearing that the gods would even see them go to the bathroom or wash in the shower made all the other students shiver. Seeing all this, the saint looked at the children with condemnation. Let them not judge the gods based on their crude human standards. Meanwhile, voices of deities were heard saying that for them there were no human standards, so let them ignore it. Bora Pachodka leaned somewhere to the side for her. It still seemed kind of wild for her to cover her mouth with the notepad. Suddenly, Mion said the gods would at least give their blessings to those in whom they were more interested. Seems the girl was determined. Meanwhile, the deities responded very well to such clear judgment, and Myung smiled, happy that she was able to gain the favor of the gods so immediately. Suddenly, the girl felt something change in her chest, as if a light began to develop. She received her first blessing faster than anyone else. Jumping up, Myung shrieked in happiness at being the first to receive the blessing. Hanu even woke up after that, but Kangmin was horrified. He thought he was the most talented and would be the first to receive the blessing of the gods, but he was beaten. Meanwhile, another student with glasses asked what this had to do with conquering the demon lord. And besides, there was a strange odor around the guards standing nearby, who shivered a little and looked among themselves. Mion's blessing was the charm. She would emit a pleasant scent with which would win the hearts of the opposite sex. Saint asked the girl to stop using her charm skill. Mion looked at her ironically and began to squirm. She smiled and said she didn't know what to do or how to stop it. Seemed she was bullying her new teacher. Suddenly heard the notice innocent goddess does not like such actions on the face of the saint showed consternation. In the meantime, Mion enjoyed her new skill and continued to attract the amazed stares of the men. Seeing the curse punishment status on their status window too, aren't they heroes for what they are given the curse for? The saint explained that besides blessings, there are also curses given by gods who don't like the hero. Mion was horrified. Leaning over to the girl, Saint said that of course Myung hadn't heard about it because she wanted to tell her about it. Suddenly, the unfortunate girl felt a strong blow on her back. Myung grabbed her back and cried out, but the pain didn't stop. And besides, her blessing was beginning to weaken as she clutched her back and sighed heavily. This punishment was unexpected and very unpleasant. The saint reminded us that once they receive their blessing or curse, it will not disappear until the moment of death. Looking at how Myung, from having such a low-level curse, inflicts such pain, the princess asked her not to give up. She tried to cheer her up in some way. Athena said that all of this could be compensated for with blessings. The body and spirit would become stronger. Myung slightly couldn't believe her ears. But smiling, the princess said that it really was true. She seemed to be very happy, and said to not let the heroes give up so easily. Being in the wilderness many kilometers away, Hansu wiped the blood from his face. He didn't understand why his level didn't change. He had destroyed a whole horde of strong monsters, whether it was because of the hero's curse, or whether leveling up was basically hard to give, was still unclear. Hansu turned to God and asked if there was any information, but Ghost asked to be called by the term outsider, and the guy corrected himself. Folding his arms on his chest, Ghost said that for now, this information, he cannot tell what a useless god thought the player. Without waiting for the angry god, the player ran deep into the forest away from this. He felt neither thirsty nor hungry. Looking ahead, Hansu wondered what would happen if he met a human here. Could he team up with them? But not even half a second later, a few meters away, the player noticed several more of the same jackals wandering around in search of prey. Meanwhile, God hoped that the outsider would quietly leave this world. Hansu got angry. If this kid was around, he would agree to hit him. One of the monsters smelled meat and was immediately alerted that the prey was somewhere nearby, and they rushed to find it. In the player's hands was a knife, the same dagger he had taken from one of the monsters. Hansu smiled. Now he would destroy some more of these dogs. The werewolf sniffed. His eyes lit up. The monster looked for prey in all places, but so far, it was empty. Watching the monsters. The player pondered. He wanted to get out of this forest, but now doesn't know which way to go. Everything has changed. Besides, this forest is full of these overgrown dogs. Looking out from behind the nearest tree, the player tried to come to his senses. The deity next to him had already started praying for his soul so that he wouldn't give up the end sooner than necessary, but the guy wasn't about to go to the other world. Taking some rope lying nearby, Hansu realized that if he was in a fantasy world, then one must engage in the kind of activities God observed. Wrapping the rope around the blade of the knife, the boy made a kind of sheath for his dagger. Then he took hold of the other end, to which the stone was tied, and smiled. If they knew what centrifugal force was, but nothing, now they would. After constructing a kind of mace, Hansu began to swing the stone as hard as he could. That's the power of science. One of the monsters was already very close to the guy and was preparing its toothy maw, but a stone flew right into his jaw. The monster realized that it was painful and dangerous and immediately rushed to the side, and it seemed to work. But these jackals weren't that stupid. They realized that the meat would soon get tired, and then they could have it all to themselves. Suddenly the boy's strength ran out, and the stone came down on his head, but he was still on his feet. And now, seeing that their prey is already beginning to run out of steam, the monsters rushed straight at the guy altogether. The clawed hand of one of the monsters was already approaching the defenseless Hansu's body, and the guy didn't move yet. And so, he swung his arm and struck several monsters that ran up to him. Only fools fall for such cheap tricks. Now he was really tired, but the monsters seemed to be defeated, or at least unconscious. They were lying around. Flying nearby, the ghost slightly upgraded his ward. Hansu was indignant at his stinginess. He had made such a marvelous plan. Approaching one of the spruce living monsters, the player took a closer look and said not to move, but to tell where people live, you had to find someone like yourself. After their prey began to speak, the jackal became terrified and immediately pointed his finger somewhere to the side, indicating that the humans were out there. The next moment, the guy asked the question, to what species these monsters belonged. It was interesting to at least understand who was in front of him. Looking at the prey, Jackal wondered, is the meat so stupid? However, the player told him to answer quickly or go to the other world. The werewolf growled that it's once and called Null, and immediately began to beg for mercy. After all, he had already answered all the questions from this angle. The animal looked pathetic. A satisfied smile stretched across the player's face. He thanked for the information, and a crunch was heard. The heavy stone immediately fell on the Null's head, and the monster only managed to squeal in pain and left this world. After all, the player did not say that if this monster answers honestly to all his questions, he will spare him, so he did not deceive anyone. The little god was horrified and started to tell him that this creature was called a Null, but Hansu said irritably that he already knew that. Though he'd seen monsters like this in games far more sympathetic than here, it was half monster, half wolf, half human. Ghost said that the young members of this world are quite nice. Hansu, with irony in his voice, thanked for this useless information. Meanwhile, in the training room, Alsa said in a cheerful voice that full-scale training would begin tomorrow, with the princess standing beside him and smiling. The man said he would teach swordsmanship, and Princess Athena magic heroes are free to choose who they go to. Kangmin raised his hand and asked if he could choose 2 classes at once. The teacher said of course he could. If they suddenly became too difficult, they could drop one of them. In response to whether or not they could not practice at all, the instructor said that even if they thought so, it was their choice. Hanu, smiling, asked, then if he could leave this temple at his leisure. Everyone else looked at him with disbelief. Standing nearby, Kangmin only smiled as he was amused by this kid's arrogance and felt like he wasn't an opponent at all. No further questions Hanu had, and only laughed. The lad was pleased with the state of affairs. A certain immature god, showing great interest in the students, heard a strange voice and everyone shivered. Meanwhile, Hanu was immersed in his childhood when he was still young and he didn't think of training as something necessary. And now it's his finest hour. The guy thought he was special. The rest of us can train and he'll go out and find adventure. A smile spread across his face, and his eyes sparkled with anticipation. He was ready to conquer this fantasy world. Raising his hand in a loud voice, Alsa said that heroes who wanted to follow the swordsman's path could follow him right now. One of the students asked about magic where they could learn it. Because the princess was not around, she had disappeared again. Smiling said she had too much to drink the night before, but is a very hard worker, so she'll be here any minute. Following that, in a loud voice, the man said that those who wanted to learn magic, let them wait here for a while. While the others were talking amongst themselves, Hanu opened the status window and began to examine his characteristics. Seeing the word special on the plaque, he smiled. It was fitting, so everything else could be skipped over altogether. Looking at Kangmin, Hanu smiled. Let this guy think he's the best and try his best. It's still useless. Hanu himself had already left the hall and was walking down the stairs, thinking about what a bright future awaited him. The guy smiled. If useless brats like this would try hard, then perhaps they could grow to rival the protagonist. A few minutes later, he was already there. Hanu decided not to bother and come straight to the Heroes Guild for the assignment. It was here that the right order could be found. Everywhere other mercenaries were sitting around, and voices could be heard. Standing near the wall were two men with blue hair and a girl with purple hair. They didn't look very friendly. At the registration window, Hannah was met by a friendly girl with glasses. She asked him what brought him to the mercenary guild. She had a bright smile on her face. With a thumbs up, the guy proudly announced that he had come here to register himself as a mercenary. Thinking that this is the way things are done in the fantasy genre, the guy decided to go that way, as suddenly he was called by someone's female voice. The player immediately turned around. The girl kept talking. She said it was no place for newbies like him or wanted to go to the other world. A girl with bright red hair stood in front of him, and with a serious look, she told him to stop doing stuff and go home. Her gaze made it clear that she wasn't kidding and wasn't planning on backing down for a second. For a second, Hanu froze in place. Could it be the main character's buff to him immediately reached such a beauty? The girl came closer to him and asked him if he could hear her at all, but the player still stood with his mouth closed. He thought it was definitely some kind of princess disguised as an ordinary adventurer, but what was she doing here? Deciding to play by the rules, Hanu said he didn't want to come back. The girl got angry, although if she's so worried, why not keep him company? You can't judge a good book by its cover. The guy spread his hands and smiled, as if the prey was coming to him. After all, they had also experienced this many times. He raised his hand up meaningfully. After all, everyone was a beginner. Raising an eyebrow, the girl looked at him. This kid turned out to be strange to her, and what's on his mind? Why does he act like he's better than everyone else? But it was worth admitting that it was true. Here he caught her. Hannah immediately turned away and glowed with happiness. He really is special in this world. He turned back and clammed up and said he couldn't tell you everything at once, but he was special. The girl was surprised. Meanwhile, the player blushed. He thought he was the hero who could save this world, the protagonist. Meanwhile, his deity laughed. Turning back, the girl asked, "What are the abilities of the chosen ones?" Hanu laughed. "They will soon find out for themselves." And the girl at the front desk just looked at him and smiled her friendly smile. She didn't understand anything. The monster, who was lying in the clearing, was breathing heavily, saying that the village was far away, and the meat needed to get out of here. The Khan, standing in front of him, was already twirling his stone, but the werewolf didn't think to lie to him, because this meat was strong with him. The guy swung around and hit the monster in the face, knocking it out completely. In front of him lay several more lifeless bodies. These guys turned out to be unexpectedly honest monsters, so primitive you can tell when they're lying. The human village should have been to the west. The player looked closer. He confirmed it by destroying a bunch of monsters. His desperate scramble had turned into something like a hunt. Suddenly Kang realized that he had become a skilled hunter as well. I wonder if this could possibly be a hidden talent player waving the rock in different directions. A certain god was looking at him upset about something, and a silence arose between them. The player looked at his body. Although he had received many wounds, he had still learned how to hunt, and all thanks to the blessing of an outsider. Spreading his arms, the guy prepared to face the world. He had not yet lost his mind, even after he had suffered so many grievous wounds. A certain god began to grumble. He was expressing his displeasure. His ward seemed to be a mere braggart. Looking at him, Kang asked, does he really want him to go to the other world or what? However, the deity seemed to be indifferent to what was happening. He just wanted to have an interesting time, and the guys moved forward. Kang turned his head and looked back to see if any of the monsters were still alive. One of the werewolves rushed at the boy with its mouth wide open, but it had not given up hope of eating meat. The player was about to pull out his dagger, but suddenly an arrow flew past and stabbed straight into the tree. Kang was frightened. Looking at the arrow, the player realized that it entered quite deep into the barrel, but only who I released remained a mystery. In front of him stood several people, one large and muscular man dressed in armor, another woman with a crossbow, most likely a marksman. Kang shuddered with fear and hid behind a tree. They were the first people he met. Hiding his sword, the guy prepared himself to fight, but for now, he must not show that he was hostile. The muscular man was saying something, but the language was unclear, and it seemed they were adventurers like Khan himself. Deciding not to get in trouble, the guy came out and raised his hands and knelt down. He said he was against violence and surrendered. They certainly cannot communicate because their languages are different. Well, at least in this way, you need to show that the player is peaceful. The adventurers were talking about something in their own language, but so far they had shown no hostility. At one point, the archer pointed her crossbow at the guy and got ready to shoot. It seems the girl still didn't trust him. Covering himself with his hands, Kang asked to wait. The guy was scared, but still trying to look friendly to keep alive. He said with a smile on his face that he doesn't bite and came from another world. He doesn't want to antagonize these people. Eventually, the adventurers spared him, and the player joined them. They moved on down the forest path. Someone addressed him, but Kang still didn't understand the language. The guy just looked away. Suddenly, the girl pointing the crossbow at him said his name, and the guy was pleased, and a smile appeared on his face. The other man also started repeating the player's name mixed with his own words, and the guy got excited. Smiles began to appear on people's faces, and the player, trying to be friendly, confirmed everything they said, although I didn't understand anything. He smiled and tried to look friendly, but he couldn't make out a single word these people said. Still, it was a relief that Kang was able to meet these adventurers. At least there was some chance of survival. Although he can't see the equipment of these people and the window of their status, most likely these people are stronger than his god was weaving somewhere behind. Ghost grudgingly pointed out that the player wasn't acting like an outsider, and he thought it was odd. Kang only nodded his head, and the god continued to complain because the player was talking to him too indifferently. After looking at the adventurers, the boy was upset that he had met people, but he could still only talk to that annoying god. Thanks to some communication, Kang was able to get their names. The hairy man's name is Gary, and he's apparently the fighter and leader of the group. He carried that outrageous huge sword behind his back. Without showing any hint of fatigue, he fought like a beast. Looking at the man's muscles, Kang only wondered how strong he was, and he probably shouldn't argue with him. Trying to appease his deity, the guy said that they were certainly nothing, as suddenly, and another man with a slightly smaller sword addressed him. He hugged the player and laughed, but Khan couldn't understand what he wanted from him. His name was Cole. He laughs a lot. Cole may be smaller than Gary, but he has a very strong body. He carries a long sword on each side of his belt and uses paired blades. Looking at the girl, Kang smiled. Her name was Misa, and she tried to say something. However, the player didn't understand anything at all. She was an attacker on this team, carrying a long crossbow. Judging by the size of this thing, it's designed for fighting monsters. When the girl pointed her finger forward, Kang finally realized that she wanted the guy to look there. There was smoke many kilometers away. If it's not a forest fire, it's possible there's a human settlement and they're going there. A smile appeared on the player's face, but finally, they are going to some settlement, and he will see other people. God was still calm. With a disgruntled look, he noticed that Kang wasn't acting like an outsider. However, the guy didn't notice it and just smiled. The player decided to just pretend that they got along. After all, just need to get out of this forest, and that's it. They stood with Cole and looked off into the distance. Suddenly, there was a crackling sound. The whole team tensed up and prepared for battle. Most likely it was some kind of monster that had found them by trail and scent. Tensing up, Kang still didn't understand what was going on. Could it be that these monsters were chasing them again? The guy was a little scared. In a second, if the court showed a whole pack of those monstrous dogs, did they still chase him? The monsters wanted meat as soon as possible. The entire team of adventurers prepared their weapons, and their faces showed that it was not the first time they had faced such a horde of monsters. Someone addressed the player by name. A smile showed on the guy's face at how many of these monsters there are here. The rest of the team moved on, leaving Kana puzzled, seeming to want to fight more than the player himself. Cole, along with Gary, rushed forward. The men scattered the werewolves in different directions, although it was hard. When Cole rushed right at the monsters, they scattered. The dogs were pretty damn smart for monsters. The men began to slowly tire the monsters, surrounded them on both sides. They were ready to attack their prey at any moment. The dogs were about to lunge at them, but suddenly one of them was hit in the eye by a crossbow arrow, and Misa seemed to have gotten there just in time. The girl stood nearby and covered the monsters with a hail of arrows. Kang stood nearby and just watched her actions. She was an accomplished marksman, so with her easy movements, she hit right on target. It seemed like a normal walk for her. Suddenly, someone approached her. The girl holding an arrow in her mouth didn't have time to load. The crossbow returned with frightened eyes. One of those monsters was already flying at her from behind. Misa wouldn't have time to move aside. She just froze in place, unable to react. Cole shouted something. The man couldn't come to his friend's aid, and he was already being attacked by one of the werewolves. Luckily, Kang reacted in time to slay the monster with a light stroke of his dagger, and a squeal and crunch was heard. In front of the boy appeared a notice that God feels uncomfortable. However, now was not the time. The player approached closer to the monster. The werewolf looked at his small prey with a fierce red gaze, a scar appearing on his face. While the player was trying to convince his patron that he was human after all, the werewolf was already pulling at him. At the last moment, he saw that he was in danger and moved forward with incredible speed. The guy had already prepared his dagger to strike. One blow, and the huge werewolf is already lying on the ground, motionless. The player handled it without much difficulty. That's right, Kang. That's right. They're only gathering around him because he's level 1. That's their mistake. Meanwhile, Gary and Cole had finished dealing with the rest of the monsters and stood leaning on their weapons, breathing heavily. The men looked back with surprised looks. They didn't expect this newcomer to be able to handle these monsters. Looking at his saviors, Kang said that if it wasn't for them, he would have been finished long ago, and was glad he had survived. But to his misfortune, he noticed that his companions were no longer so friendly. They pointed their weapons at him. Misa, whom the player had so recently covered, also pointed her crossbow at him and hummed something to herself under her nose, as if she didn't want to listen to him. The arrow whizzed by with incredible speed and stabbed right into Kanu's chest. The guy felt incredible pain all over his body, but still didn't understand why. He fell to the ground, thrown off by the recoil, and the rest of the mercenaries just stared at him and talked in their own language. The dark shroud forgot the guy's eyes, and the 3 mercenaries just stared at him idly and didn't say a word. Looking at his friend, Cole praised Misa for a good job, or else, because of those monsters, their plan would have failed. The girl said it was for the best. On the player, Misa said that thanks to the monsters, they were able to figure out how dangerous this guy was, which turned out to be pretty bad. Shivering big, Gary said it would be dangerous if they stuck to the original plan. Who knows what could happen? They were a little offended for a second, but it couldn't be helped. After all, this world is a violent place, and you have to be careful. This guy would hardly volunteer to be sold into slavery. Meanwhile, Kang lay unmoving. Gary offered to at least take the guy's dagger, but Cole said it was probably not worth anything. However, the big guy didn't stop. Perhaps this item is worth more than they think at first glance, worth checking out. Cole and Misa glanced at each other and sighed heavily, but his comrades would not change his mind. He had always had such a temper. And besides, the decorations on this dagger looked like the family crest of the elves. Cole was already interested and came closer to the lifeless guy. He leaned closer and looked at the mercenary's face in surprise. But look at this guy. Even going to the other world did not let go of your weapon. The mercenary smiled and chuckled at the hapless newcomer. Standing behind, Misa shouted to her companion to be careful. Perhaps this man is still alive. Who knows what he is up to? However, the man didn't even think of listening to her. He drew his long blade and already raised it up to strike the final blow. Cole was about to finish it, but suddenly he felt something strange. He looked closer, and a look of fear appeared on his face. A second later, the unfortunate mercenary felt a sharp object in his throat. It was the blade of the very dagger he wanted to take. Misa and Gary, who were standing behind them, were horrified that their comrade had miscalculated and was now in danger of taking a very dangerous turn. The same newcomer who a moment ago had been lying motionless was now on his feet and holding their comrade. There was an arrow sticking out of Kana's chest, but the boy was alive. Despite everything, he was now furious that he had been betrayed so treacherously. The mercenaries who were still alive started to panic. What's wrong with this guy? Why he's still alive? Maybe he's a demon. The big man. Gary felt his arms weakened after the recent battle. The ball was too heavy, so he couldn't fight at full strength. However, the player was already ready. He was approaching the big man in large leaps and was already preparing to strike. The man did not immediately notice. The hero's eyes lit up with excessive energy. Kang was furious and wanted to massacre the others instantly. The first blow, and the man was struck down. A second later, another arrow stabbed into his chest. However, the guy survived. The blow was not critical. Now, Misa didn't understand what the man was talking about, but the player pulled the arrow out of his chest and smiled like a madman. The girl stood in front of him and forgot how to breathe from fear. She just held her heavy crossbow with shaking hands. The player spoke in a language she did not understand. The girl heard only her name. Her eyes reflected fear. Real animals' terror. She cried. I said she was sorry. The mercenary begged to be spared. She wanted to live. At that moment, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. Looking at her with mad eyes, Kang didn't even seem to think about sparing her. Only lifeless fury was in his chest. A smile twitched on Misa's face, and she didn't know what the man was talking about, but it was clear that nothing good could be expected from his actions. After a few seconds, everything was over, and the player was already trying on the archer's outfit, which turned out to be quite uncomfortable. God seemed to be very happy. However, the player said that it is not a hobby. It is a necessity to survive in this harsh world. Only this girl was the right size for him. The armor of those two guys was too heavy and ugly, so not an option. Perhaps it was worth taking this bow with him. Yikang even picked it up in his hands after looking at the ghost flying beside him. He thought about why on earth these people had decided to attack him, but at the last second, he managed to look at the status window. God ignored all the guy's questions and asked what would happen next. Khan replied that he wanted to go to the village and find out more. In the hands of the player held a weighty bag of coins here, and the money turned out to get rich. Now you cannot worry. Meanwhile, in the training room, the princess was telling the other students about magic. It was their first class, and the students listened attentively. The girl said that a long time ago on the continent of fantasy, no magic in principle was. On her face constantly had some strange smile. One of the students said that he had read about it in some fantasy novel, and this knowledge came in handy. But one girl with glasses said he's just pathetic. Magic is chemistry. She'll show them the first atomic bomb magic in fantasy history. Bora asked to be quiet. She is trying to concentrate on the lesson. The student looked at her. She doesn't seem to know much about fantasy if she listens like that. The girl looked at them with disdain and only hummed something under her breath. She was terribly uncomfortable around these people. The princess said she didn't like the theory either. Talent is really quite a significant thing, especially in magic if you look at it that way. Smiling broadly again, Athena said that since that was the case, the explanation about the founder was a necessary element. Everyone around them started whispering they didn't hear about the founder. Meanwhile, the princess snapped her fingers, and a small flame appeared in her hand. She said that talent was determined by their bloodline and acquired connections in the academy. The most important thing in magic is talent. The girl smiled and continued to talk passionately about how important talent is to her students. All the other students were looking at her with their mouths open, and now they didn't say a word. They were interested in hearing everything the teacher said. The princess, meanwhile, said she's a descendant of an archmage, so she has both noble lineage and academic connections. Meanwhile, Bora raised her hand, and apologizing for interrupting such an important lecture, said she had a question. The princess smiled. The girl asked in a slightly sinking voice if it was possible to achieve great success in magic without it. There was silence everywhere. Bora stood and kept silent. She thought that this question was unnecessary and insignificant. The girl felt a little ashamed. The princess covered her mouth with her hand and looked at the student for a few seconds with a surprised look, as if pondering the essence of her question. But after a second, her eyes lit up, and she shrieked that she was sure it was possible. It seemed impossible to upset this girl. The princess jumped up to the student and said she would explain about it later. She took the girl's hands and started to say something. Taking the girl's hands, the princess said that from now on, she was establishing a bond as between master and apprentice with this hero. Suddenly, Bora felt that there were some processes going on in her body. It was as if she was filled with energy, and it was incredible. A magical symbol appeared behind the girl. She stood still and could not move. Opposite stood the princess. She recognized her as the first student. The others looked at her in surprise. No one expected that this unassuming girl would be able to pull this off. Now she had to swear an oath using magic. Bora felt as if she had begun to fly against her will. After a second, it was over. Her head cleared up, and the girl looked around her with a surprised look. The princess congratulated her. She said that today's Bora is a full-fledged wizard on the princess's face. A smile shone on her face as always. The girl could not believe her happiness. She just clapped her eyes and tried to comprehend everything that was happening. In a sing-song voice, Athena said that she forgot to mention that whoever becomes her first apprentice by inheritance gets a lot more talent than the others. Looking at her status window, the girl said that as soon as the princess declared her an apprentice, then a blessing appeared. It was a talent. The teacher asked the student now. She understood why talent was so important. For a second, the girl thought for a second and nodded her head. Smiling, the princess closed her eyes and said she would then return to the first question, and the lecture continued. She put her hand out in front of her, and on it again lit that same playful firelight. It was practical magic. The founder who created magic left behind her blessings to make it easier for her descendants and future students. The princess raised her hand up, and the fire began to flare up and turned into a real bonfire. The sight was truly breathtaking. All around opened their mouths in surprise, and the princess continued to show. Bora stood next to her and flapped her eyes, still not realizing her happiness. The princess spread her arms and prepared to show another spell. It was white magic. In one hand, she lit up a firelight, and in the other, some purple crystal. The princess frowned and intensified her magic. The same purple fire began as if to corrode the clothes on the princess's arm. A crackling sound was heard. All the other students were horrified. They didn't expect magic to be able to do something like this, and a chill ran down their spine. After that, the teacher grinned. They were asking, "Always talent is important in magic, isn't it?" Bora, who was standing behind her, trembled with fear. She had not expected the princess to attach such importance to her seemingly ordinary question. Athena explained that the right hand is white magic and the left hand is black magic. That's the difference. So let them look and think. Suddenly, there was a scream from the princess. All the other students were surprised and frightened and looked away. "Where did you come from?" the older governess, and started to find the princess by the cheeks. She reminded that she was forbidden to use black magic. Falling to the ground, the unfortunate girl said she only did it to make it easier for the heroes to understand. The assistant frowned. She said she would report to the queen, her face expressing nothing but condemnation and severity. The woman was very disappointed. The princess sniffed her nose and asked not to say anything to the queen, next to the healer, who had already appeared to treat her arm. In a trembling voice, Bora said she was sorry. She shouldn't have asked that question. However, the princess assured that it was okay. Smiling, she said in a happy voice that she was just glad that the students now understood the difference between white and black magic. The students whispered. They asked, "What is black magic? What is some evil force?" Or, as the princess explained, black magic is a force of nature. Meanwhile, he had already reached the nearest settlement and was trying to talk to the guards, who could not understand him. The guard tried to say something. However, Kang didn't understand anything either. The man raised his eyes upwards. However, the player finally realized what they wanted from him and handed the guard a few silver coins, which seemed to be the end of their conversation. Going inside, the guy saw that there are quite a lot of armed people walking around. This city is in the middle of a forest with monsters. The guy's gaze fell on a sign with a picture of an elf sitting in a bathtub holding a beer glass in his hand, which seemed to be the establishment they were talking about. He had managed to get a small room, and now Kang was washing his face and wiping his face with a towel. He finally managed to get a shower. Now the player looked at least a little better, and the god, meanwhile, was feeling some discomfort. Khan smiled. The guy was sitting in a large basin and taking a bath. He was also uncomfortable, and he decided to ask what sex this deity was. Kang looked at his hand and saw a bloodstain that wouldn't come off no matter how hard he tried. Noticing his patron's concern, the player asked what was wrong. However, God said it was a secret and hid it in his heart. Suddenly, Kang heard some strange voices. He was suddenly able to understand the speech of several people, most likely standing outside the door. Not wanting his bathing procedures to be interrupted, the player asked to wait a little longer. He is still taking a shower. Hearing the approval, he got up and started to get dressed, It wasn't worth keeping these strange people waiting. The man he can communicate with is standing just outside the door. Kang took up his dagger and prepared to fight back just in case. The player thought that the one behind the door was not really a person, but a representative of a hostile race guy prepared. For a second, by the weight of the silence, the player stood on full alert, if something happens to have to fight back. Recent events immediately came to mind. Perhaps it was one of those werewolves, or perhaps demons, in any case worth checking out. Walking a few steps to the door, Khan knocked and tried to pull himself together. The guy wanted to open the door. Pulling back the latch, the player sat down on the nearest couch and asked to come in, saying he was ready. The doors creaked open. A polite voice apologized for the intrusion, and the visitor stepped inside. It was a strange-looking man with long gray hair and a slightly sad, heavy look. He walked forward. The first to speak was Kang. He asked what was wrong, and the man told the boy not to worry. He was the headman of the village. Explaining that he had received notice of a strange trip himself, he decided to ascertain what these alien pages, speaking a foreign language, were. The player looked more closely and became wary of the strange man who looked too young to be old, perhaps just disguised. Yes, and besides, as expected, he can see the player's status window. Somehow uncomfortable the guy felt at this point. Hearing that the status window could be hidden, Kang was very surprised, and the headman asked, "Doesn't the guy know anything? He is here for the first time." Leaning over, the man said that he thought he would see an elf sneaking in unnoticed, but apparently this man came from far away. The man explained that due to the greed of the elves, the gnolls had started attacking this village, coming out of their hiding places. And many of them lost their relatives and friends. This village was built by those very victims, one of whom was this headman. During this conversation, the deity looked very upset. The ghost was ready to burst into tears on the spot, barely holding back. The headman politely asked, "Can he ask one question before the strange traveler leaves?" Kang nodded his head. Pulling a small bottle out of his pocket, the man showed it to the light. It was a vial of some kind of potion. He hesitated and said it's been hours since he slipped the paralytic. So why is the guy still on his feet? It was after this phrase that everything became clear. Kang jumped up from his seat and rushed at the headman, snatching a dagger from under his pillow. But no sooner had he gotten closer than suddenly his body really was numb. He was paralyzed, only it wasn't the effect of the potion. Hiding the bottle behind his back, the headman said that dark elves have a high coefficient of resistance to such poison, and he hid it on purpose. Taking the dagger, the headman looked at him and smiled. He told the guy to just give up here. It wasn't his fault. He was just unlucky. The deity next to him said that he tried to warn his ward. However, Kang didn't listen. Only now, the boy realized where he was going. After a few minutes, the player was already in a dungeon in some basement and was chained with strong shackles. The guy was furious. He'd fallen for such a commonplace trick, and now he had to listen to this lunatic. Meanwhile, the headman was raging, cursing the elves for being responsible for the battle that had plagued their village. Smiling, the man said to the player to look at his status windows. This is the price to be paid by anyone who knows the truth. The man's name was Karmazin. The player immediately asked, "Is this curse the work of the goddess?" But the man replied that it is Isa elves, more precisely because of the offense. Trying to smooth things over, the guy said that he did not belong to the race of elves. There was a monstrous mistake. Everything is not as he thinks. In a second, a sharp dagger was near the player's face. Frozen all in a few centimeters on the back of the guy ran goosebumps. Looking at him with a monstrous look, Karmazin said he hadn't really planned to tell the man so much. The man was getting furious. The man said that when he saw the dagger in the player, he changed his mind and immediately asked where the guy got it, Kang, while he pondered. He wondered if he should tell that weird psycho what had happened. He wasn't stupid enough on the other side to give away all the secrets right away. Yes, and behind this man's back were two bound elves. Need to survive at all costs. Player looked at the point of the dagger and prepared to need to find some way out of here. He smiled and said that this dagger was inherited from an elf he destroyed after he shot him for no reason. When the madman learned this, he was upset that it was now more and more difficult for him to destroy this imposter. Kang then asked to be spared. Turning away, Karmazin said, "It's a real shame he's a mage without a magical blessing," but the player didn't quite understand what he was talking about. The man wondered. The guy explained that it was all because he was an outsider. He didn't have a man or god who could kindly explain it. Karmazin didn't seem to really understand the meaning of the word either, and the player hurriedly explained that he was a lone wolf. Taking in his face, Warlock said it was a cool word, but now the guy wouldn't be able to wander the wild land, Khan wondered. The deity has already managed to bury his ward. The guy came to a rage. Why does everyone act like this? Does he really have to go to the other world? With a wave of his hand, the sorcerer lit a few candles, and a few green lights immediately flared up. One of the elves fell to the ground with a thud and immediately listened to his pitiful moaning. His entire body was bandaged. Walking over to him, Karmazin put his foot on him and pressed the elf. Muled his mouth was gagged. The sorcerer held up a candle and kept stepping on the elf's body, saying that he was a dark mage and the elf must sacrifice himself to continue his life. The sorcerer slowly came to rage. He said that his life was shortened, but he could continue his fight forever, prolonging the lives of the victims. And as a reward for the destruction of the royal elf, the sorcerer promised that the guy would go to the other world quickly and painlessly. The player smiled with irony in his voice and thanked him for such generosity, but of course he didn't plan to leave this world yet. Kang was sure that he could find a way out of this situation. He just had to try and think. As soon as the player approached him, the headman looked at him and said that if Kang was going to beg him, it was useless. However, the player shook his head. Of course he was not going to beg, but to forgive. Khan smiled and looked at his tormentor. With a mad grin on his face, the player said that was certainly not the case. His laughter spread throughout the locked room. After all, the headman agreed to listen to the request of the one who will soon go to the other world. A wide smile appeared on his face. When Karmazin heard that his captives began to move, he smiled at the noise of the bugs. A second later, a long whip appeared in his hands, and it was not hard to guess what would follow. Tycho Khan, who had been sitting all this time, only watched in horror at the cruelty of this mad headman who hated elves. Soon, the prisoner fell silent and only sobbed quietly lying on the floor. The sorcerer turned his head and said cheerfully that at last there was silence. At some point, the player realized that it seems this madman had purposely shown him such cruelty. Now the guy decided his best bet was to rub it in with trust and said it's pretty hard to go down paths that no one recognizes. After a second, the sorcerer's face lit up with joy. Did this guy really understand him in his eyes? A little hope appeared, and a smile appeared on his face. With a smile on his face, Kang replied that it was all because she was an outsider. The guy was hoping hard to gain the trust of this weird, crazy man. The sorcerer looked at him and clarified the player had said that it was a lone wolf roaming the wilderness, right? A smile spread across his face again. The man wondered if this also meant he was an outsider like his captor or not. The deity emphasized that it was not so, and the player himself understood it, but it was necessary to at least somehow mitigate the situation. Sorcerer said he likes this guy should continue to be a lone wolf. Strange logic, of course, but there is no choice. When Kang saw his patron laughing uproariously, he got angry. There's nothing to laugh about. The situation is critical. Why is this god laughing? The sorcerer's face became even crazier as he shouted for the guy to stay where he was now. Fury glittered in the man's eyes. However, the player did not understand what this man wanted from him. He is already in his place chained up worse situation, and it is difficult to imagine. Then the fiend turned to the elves hanging from the chains and looked closely at them laughing. Approaching one of the captives, the man took a closer look. Should he choose the one who was now in the worst condition? The elf gritted his teeth and hissed something in his own language. Most likely it was some kind of swear words, but they remained unintelligible to our hero. In the eyes of the sorcerer, again gleamed, excitement will not go, so his girlfriend must stay alive to further entertain him so that in business will go man. Pulling on the chain, the warlock collapsed the restrained body, and the elf flopped loudly to the ground, right in the center of the strange, magical symbol. With his bloody fingers folded in front of him, the sorcerer prepared himself for the time to begin, and now he was going to have a lot of fun with these prisoners. The magic symbol began to glow violet, and some vibration was heard. The air was filled with a strange energy, and became as if liquid. Continuing to stand idly by the wizard, said to confirm that he was handing him his life freely and forever. Realizing what awaited him, but not willing to accept his fate, the elf gritted his teeth and wanted to say something. Leaning over to his test subject, the mad scientist said that if he did this, he would immediately send his girlfriend back. Of course, the sorcerer was lying. Taking the elf by the hair, Karmazin said that they should learn from past experience what it costs to refuse his mercy, so you don't want to make a mistake twice. The elf wheezed but said nothing. He just stared with eyes full of hatred at his tormentor and seemed ready to tear him apart. And all the while, Can, who was sitting behind him, didn't understand what was going on with this old man. Did he become so young by taking years away from the elves? Taking a closer look, the guy asked himself, did everything fail? But no. The guy squinted even better. Stepping on the burned body of the elf, the man said that everything went well in his voice and heard the joy mixed with delight. However, he did not become younger by more than 1 year. Karmazin hastened to explain all, because he is not a man. On his face glittered a fierce smile. Approaching the boy, he added that, and the elves, he sacrificed not to prolong his life. The player looked at him with incomprehension. With a mad face and a smile, the man said that all this time being in the village, he had taken many lives, so all that was left of the curse was the name. The thing is, as soon as he got the curse, he immediately became a decrepit and old cripple in literally 1 second. If the wandering magician had not lived in the village then, the man who decided to conduct the experiment did not know how it would have ended. Seeing the strange scientist begin to undress, Khan wondered what he was even doing. He looked at the sorcerer with an expectant stare, but from what the guy saw, his eyes widened even more, and his mouth opened on its own in surprise. There was a werewolf face in this man's chest, but how is that possible? Is it some kind of mutant? Is this some kind of genetic experiment? However, with the same smile, Karmazin said that he was actually a gnoll. This monstrous voice penetrated to the very core of consciousness. Fear rippled through the player's body. What kind of hybrid animal is this? Is this possible? Is this some kind of genetic mutation? The man came to rapture. Isn't it wonderful? Now that he has the body of a werewolf and the wisdom of humans, he can do anything. It's dark magic at its best, hunting elves with their own power. Doesn't that seem like the most ingenious solution ever? The sorcerer lowered himself to the player and put his hand on his shoulder. Khan said that he wasn't really an elf, but it didn't matter. Continuing to smile, Witchfinder said that because the guy told him about the outsiders, now he knows who he is. And in gratitude, uses his life wisely. After all, the player realized that this weirdo intends to destroy him pathetically. Karmazin nodded his head. Of course, he's going to do it because he's an outsider, so there's no other way out. As a closer look at the player, realized that in front of him the most real madman and talked to him constructively just does not make sense. While in her castle, many kilometers away, the Princess Archmage was walking through a field of flowers and enjoying her life. She has always been respected and nicknamed the genius of the Archivegas kingdom. She has always admired hard-working people. The girl, being a princess, devoted her whole life to it, but thanks to her amazing talent, she never had to make a lot of effort. Raising her hand, Bora asked if there wasn't a more efficient way to create magic than imagination since it was slow. It was because of this young student's diligence that the princess decided to make her her first heir. It struck her in the heart. That was an excellent question, the princess smiled. In that case, girls would have to imitate the magic of your teacher or parents. But there's something else. The princess let her hand out in front of her, and there immediately appeared incredibly light and warm. All came to delight. They did not understand what it was, but it looked simply mesmerizing. Is it really a new kind of magic? A second later, in the princess's hands, appeared a small statue of a rabbit made of magic crystal. It continued to glow in energy. Eventually, Bora realized that this is real ice magic, looked at though simple but actually mesmerizing. Through patronage, the royal family receives some of the talents of their own ancestors. It is because of this that they are able to use flame magic for a period of time. The princess held out the rabbit forward. On the other hand, this ice bunny is created with her own magic. She offered to try to make as well. Bora, who was standing in front of everyone, was a little surprised and frightened at such a sudden suggestion and thought for a long time. The girl tried to make a magical gesture with her hands, but so far her hands remained empty. And then the princess realized that as a teacher she had a long way to go before she could be called a master. When her own skill increases, her young apprentice will also be able to use this magic. The princess smiled. Confused, Bora thanked the princess for her detailed explanation, but she didn't really understand anything. Suddenly a voice was heard from the crowd. Someone most likely wanted to ask another question. The princess looked up with wide eyes. It was Myung. She asked embarrassedly about someone who didn't have blessings like her. Following the girl, everyone began to raise their hands. Many of them also didn't have a blessing and wanted to learn magic too. Seeing the princess's reaction, everyone else was a little startled and hushed. A small whisper crept through the rows. However, the idea came to the princess's mind rather quickly. She said to then come up with who would be her second apprentice, that's all. All the others fell silent. They thought it was a great honor, but in the end, the princess behaves extremely inconsiderate. And then each of the students started begging the princess to make him her second apprentice. Everyone in unison began to plead with the princess because of one single phrase. The union collapsed. It was like a sand fortress that crumbled literally at the touch of a button, and all the students began to feud with each other. And only little Bora stood looking around. The princess said they should tell her when they decided. The girl looked at the princess and asked, did she do it on purpose, so the students would just get behind her? With a surprised look on her face, Athena asked the girl what she meant, as if she didn't know what she was talking about. So they settled on the Ice Bunny's own magic can only be created through endless trial and error. Hearing the student's question about black magic, the princess stumbled a bit on the spot. She didn't expect such a thing. Bora noticed it too and looked at the teacher in surprise. She thought she had done something wrong again. The princess looked in front of her with a slightly disappointed look and sadly said that black magic was different from white magic. Her voice trembled slightly. And at this time, being in the underground laboratory of the madman, Kang saw the result of black magic with his own eyes. Now Vaughn was already standing in the middle of a magical symbol and was to be sacrificed in the name of crazy ideas. Even at a time like this, the scientist turned to his buddy. The guy looked in front of him and breathed heavily. The sorcerer reached forward and asked for confirmation that the player bequeaths his life to him as a legacy. Looking at the strange old man, Kang said that similar consent of the victims is important in black magic after all. So, rather, it is an essential attribute. Karmazin said that even if the victims can't move, it doesn't mean they belong to one person. Unable to endure, the man said that enough talk, let his comrade take his oath immediately. Realizing that this was his chance, the player shouted for him to wait for a moment before he had a small request, at least one last one before the end of his life. The clearly annoyed warlock looked at him with furious eyes and asked what else he wanted. In as shaky and as pitiful voice as possible, Kang said that before he went to the next world, he would like more than anything to see Misa again. The mad sorcerer pondered is a mercenary who uses a large crossbow. So why is the player looking for this woman? The man pondered. And then Kang blurted out the first thing that came into his head, embarrassed, and said that he was Misa's boyfriend, a silly smile appearing on his face. The sorcerer grabbed the boy by the scruff of the neck and said, "That's nonsense. He is the village chief and knows everything that happens here. Every single person knows her boyfriend's name is Cole, even if he doesn't try to pull something like this using favor with her." The player's plan failed. He thought he was just a normal crazy person, but it looks like he's fulfilling his duties as headman. However, the headman asked, does Kang want to say that he is now her boyfriend, and where is the evidence the player stood in front of him and has been silent so far? However, Khan had something in store. He said to let the headman sniff it, and he'd know right away. The man had done all that was required of him, and indeed, this stranger smelled like a girl, but it was still a pity for him. If the mercenary goes missing, her comrades will definitely suspect something wrong, and it will be very unfortunate. Smiled, the guy said he understood everything. The player looked at the strange madman and bided his time. The player had another wish. If he survived this experiment, then let the scientists release him. Sorcerer was surprised. After all, he couldn't think of anything. But still, he agreed. Then Yikang promised that everything would happen anyway, as the sorcerer wished. Well, the deal was done. The man folded his fingers in front of him, and in his eyes, the madness glittered again. He was ready to perform his experiment. He felt something start to happen to his body, a vibration, and then a powerful pulse. Thank you, it's like a lightning bolt went through my body. Damn village headman. He said it would be painless. Just in case, the headman said goodbye to the boy and said he'd tell her he'd gone far away, but the boy smiled it would be slightly wrong. Hearing that, in fact, Misa had actually left, first the headman was surprised and raised an eyebrow at what this man meant. However, Kang was already preparing his powerful blow. His fist clenched, and the guy threw himself straight at his tormentor with his last strength. There was a slapping sound of a blow. The man who had not expected anything like this could not take it with dignity, and his head toppled over. The sorcerer became furious. This brat dared to hit him, and yet he was even favorable to him. However, the player prepared, and only now the madman realized that he had been tricked. Wiping his face from the drops of blood, the man looked at his victim with rage. After that, the player became furious. It was his line as well as his words about a painless demise. It was painful after all. With a wave of his hand, Kang said that because of something like this, even his best friend turned worst enemy. The guy was humoring as much as he could. Meanwhile, the sorcerer was just in shock. How is it possible that this boy could survive such a discharge? Warming his hands, the player said that the sorcerer will figure it out when he goes to the other world, and it's not that far away. The thing was, it was a non-lethal blow, and the blessing of an outsider restored him completely. Now alive and well, Kang stood right in front of the distraught mage who understood nothing. However, with his last strength, the headman tried to convince himself that it was just a coincidence this newcomer had survived due to luck. At the same moment, the player reminded the sorcerer of his promise. He had said he would let him go if he survived. So a deal is worth more than money. It was time to hold up his end of the bargain. He reached for the dagger, lying somewhere nearby on the table. It was time to call it a day. Taking his weapon back, he thought to himself, I need to deal with this sorcerer before he does more horrible things. Looking to the side, the guy saw that there were a few elves sitting there bound hand and foot, and there was his prize. The player grasped his dagger tighter and swung to strike. The elves shrank back. There was a cracking sound, and the shackles on one elf's arm snapped in half, and she was free. The girl didn't understand anything yet. She just stared at herself in surprise. She didn't believe that this strange stranger would release her like that. But now there is a witness player came up to her and took her by the hand. The elf did not understand anything yet, but gave in. She looks like she has no strength. So Kang, in one deft movement, hefted the uncomprehending girl onto his shoulder. She was shouting something in her own incomprehensible language, but the guy didn't hear anything, or pretended it was time to get the hell out of here. Pushing off the ground with an unprecedented force, with tremendous speed, the player ran straight to the exit before the door was only a few meters away. The sorcerer, who had come to his senses, shouted at them, "Where are they going?" The man had not expected anything like this from the strange boy. He shouted that this should not be done. However, the player was already running towards the exit of this strange laboratory. Kang turned around and asked in a sarcastic voice. The headman had not forgotten his promise. As Karmazin watched him, he was furious at the promise he had made to let him live, but he seemed to have changed his mind. That promise could be revoked if he let go of the length of life he had taken in the man's hand, concentrated energy. Energy tentacles reached for the boy, and several of them grabbed his legs. The player felt he couldn't run. So it wasn't a bluff. Khan realized it too late. And now he was trapped. The sorcerer was much stronger. In a sad voice, the wizard said that he was quite disappointed in his new companion and would have to give up the idea of destroying him painlessly. The man wanted to say something else, but suddenly he coughed and felt a strange pain in his chest. Blood spurted from his mouth. Sorcerer didn't understand what was happening or why he felt such intense pain inside his body. Suddenly something began to change. The energy literally overwhelmed him, and the man began to scream in pain. He was no longer in control of himself. Looking at him, the player ironically asked what had happened to him all this time he had been holding the Elphys on his shoulder. The power left the man, and the sorcerer fell to his knees, unable to move a finger anymore. Looking in front of him, Karmazin couldn't believe what he was seeing. No human would remain unharmed after he stole so much life force. He shouted and wanted to know what was this guy's real identity. His face began to rapidly cover with wrinkles. He was aging before his eyes. When the player started talking, the spirit became abusive because his charge was behaving too defiantly. Well, he made a decision. Swinging the dagger in front of him said that he was the apostle of the outsider. A smile shone on the guy's face. At this time, the deity was just burning with shame, and the player was glad they were happy. It was time to end it. Putting aside the thought that he would get a lot of experience for being an elder, the player said that he needed to focus on escaping from here. Hearing the man's voice change, Kang stopped for a second and looked back. Something began to change. The very head of the werewolf began to speak in a barking voice. He promised to eat that meat for ruining his own dream. The sorcerer's entire body began to change, his skin drying out and turning a crimson hue, his eyes a white film. Suddenly, the mad warlock regained the ability to move and immediately lunged at the boy who was not expecting anything like this and had to leave. Literally a few centimeters away from the player's body, a clawed paw swept by, barely reaching him at the last moment. The monster's voice sounded as if from afar. Grabbing his shoulder in advance, the player sat on his knees, dropping the elf on the ground. He went on to say, The thing is, this power is called the Knoll Blade. There's no trace of the man anymore. Karmazin has lost his identity. Crouching down on one knee, Kang grasped his wound on his chest was a deep cut, but the guy was still alive. After he started talking, the dog was surprised and looked at his former victim. It turned out that the guy was alive and well, and the wounds healed in just a second, although it was quite painful and risky. The sorcerer was furious. He had already spent all his strength and could no longer resist. His body weakened. A second later, Khan appeared behind him and was already preparing his blade for the final finishing blow. The sorcerer wanted to say something else. He moved forward, but someone was holding him by the leg, and the man put his head down, and there was the elf woman. He was about to hit her, but a player appeared behind him who was already preparing a dagger, with only a few seconds left before the final blow. In rage, the warlock shouted at the elfess, but missed the fact that a sharp blade was already flying at him from the side. The pixie sitting behind her stared with frightened eyes in front of her, but it wasn't enough. There was one more head left. Raising his blade above him, Khan prepared to finish what he had started. The dog's head screamed with hopelessness and rage. Tears appeared on the monster's face as he said goodbye to his daughter and apologized to her for her daddy's failure to avenge her. At last, the player wished him to rest in peace and cut short his life. The lifeless body of the sorcerer sank to the ground. Kang then slung his dagger on his shoulder and decided where he would head back to, but first he needed to free someone. He had cut the bindings on the elves' arms and legs, and now they were helping to free the others, all of whom were alive and well. The player decided to let everyone go free. Even the guards and all the villagers came to deal with the situation, and it horrified them. It seemed that everything was over, and all Remain player was ready to go on wandering. He put on his backpack. But suddenly, the guy noticed something strange and turned his head to the rest of the villagers. Something in their faces wasn't right. They looked surprised and frightened at the strange guest who had destroyed their headman, and their gazes read fear and incomprehension. It took Kanu a lot of effort to get out of that village. On the way he cursed the elves for what they told there. The boy turned back with a frightened and furious look. He looked at this cursed village from which it was so hard to leave alive. He had to jump off the cliff once again to somehow save his life. Nearby, whistling arrows began a real hunt for him. Meanwhile, there was a childish quarrel in the academy over the problem of apprenticeship, but then there were many mages who wanted to become mentors. There were enough sorcerers willing to take on a personal mentor as an apprentice to resolve this quarrel, and it was over quickly. Meanwhile, the princess was giving another lecture. She said that students should visualize the image of magic in their head more clearly. A few students held their hands in front of them, in which a small flame was already blazing, which gradually flared further and further away. Hearing about math, the princess wondered a bit about it. After all, it is a subject that is studied usually by merchants in magic. 2 is better than 1. It was the same curly-haired guy who specialized in fantasy. He talked formulas for magic like fixed calculus. When he heard that there was nothing like that here, he immediately turned green with surprise. Did they really not even study such simple sciences? The curly-haired boy skillfully used fire magic, and all only because they had a good mentor who was skilled in fire, not formulas. The guy couldn't believe it. He thought it was easy to become an archmage only because of his knowledge, but in the end it turned out to be the opposite. One of the sorcerers entering next to the long beard said that it looked like the princess had made a mistake in her explanation. The girl was surprised. When he heard the confirmation of his theories, the kid was happy. He knew he needed math. The bearded sorcerer said that since it was about a fireball, he would continue his explanation if necessary. The sorcerer explained that the princess had studied the theory, so she may not know, but they implemented mathematical formulas to increase efficiency. That way, during the battle, one could avoid losing strength, and the sorcerer launched an energy ball into the air. And besides, to shoot a fireball at a distance, you have to calculate the angle and tilt. The man released the fire projectile from his hand, and a second later, there was a deafening rumble as the fireball exploded right in the air. Then turning to the curly-haired boy, the old man asked him if he had talked about it correctly. The student did not know what to say. The sorcerer said nothing. If the old man offers a little help, the princess can also learn the practical application of magic. The frustrated princess agreed, but her knowledge was not enough to explain everything to the students, so she had to make concessions. Practical magic, real battle, skillful magician. All of this just blew my mind. Led by outstanding mentors, ordinary heroes quickly learned magic without any problems. Outstanding god of law watched with a pseudo-satisfaction. In a small town, there was a real thunderstorm. The rain was pouring down the streets, and everywhere you could hear the rumblings of thunder. Taking her friend's hand in hers, the elf tried to heal her wounds with panting everywhere, which didn't seem to be a very pleasant procedure. The two girls sat across from each other. One with blue hair was grooming the other. She had already put enough on, needed a little more patience. The elven girl with golden hair was named Espresso. She was a servant elf princess. Only a miracle from a saint could help her heal and get well. But there was no way that one of the two saints in the whole world could help. Gave the miracle to a simple elf who even seemed to be of royal blood, but still the probability was extremely small. Her friend calmed her down and told her that they would definitely catch this man, and now they should at least rest a little and clean up. The maid realized that when she returned to her home, she would have to report this village to her own family. The girl was crying and wiping her hot tears with her hand, but suddenly someone knocked on the door. She asked, in a crying voice, who was there. It was another pixie. She had long red hair. She introduced herself. She was allowed to enter. The girl timidly opened the door. She reported that a report was received from the mercenaries. They lost track of that man, so it's impossible to find him. Looking at her with an angry look, Espresso asked, "And why would she need this information? Do they have to worry about human problems?" The maid said that this man saved her from the terrible headman, so a little respect would be nice. But the elf didn't rest. What about the princess's dagger that this stranger had? Would they let themselves be fooled again like they had been before? The maid did not calm down. After all, this man really saved her out of good intentions and had nothing wrong. Underneath shouldn't be so cruel. Espresso calmed down a bit and said that she didn't say that it should be destroyed, but it's just animal writhing and it's tense, and the girl almost cried. The elfess looked in front of her, calling them beasts was too much. The elfess's voice trailed off into a whine. Suddenly, Elder Syllables entered the room. She immediately turned to her maid and demanded an explanation. Everyone around her stirred. The maid immediately rushed to her lord's aid and picked up her weakened body, but the elder demanded an explanation at all costs. This elven woman was an elder with a name that in the ancient language means sacred son. She was of royal descent. However, because of her eternal life, she became a toy that Elder Karmazin treasured. He played with her and used her for his own purposes. Hearing that everything was over, the elder screamed. She didn't want to believe it could still be fixed. The girl broke down crying. The aide picked her up under her arms and tried to get her to her feet. Despite the fact that this man could run away with me, he freed the elder. However, despite this, Espresso still didn't believe. She thought this man was after her eternal life and was only eager to get his hands on it. However, the elder looked at her evil maid and said, did she know that this person used the fact of dark magic? What Khan used was a breach of contract. If the contract is terminated, you will need to pay an equal amount. So the headman underestimated this guy's life expectancy and paid for it with his life, which makes sense. The elder lowered her head, poor maid. The way she innocently flitted around the royal palace is still on her mind now. It's the past. Tilting her head in front of her, Espresso cried, they don't know. Through what she went through, the more humiliation she experienced, nothing could compare. The elder agrees. Of course, she doesn't understand it, but against all odds, she must find this man to stop it from happening. The assistant standing next to him said that the elder wasn't in a position to do anything right now, so he should worry about himself first. Celebs then looked at her assistant and said that if they had to meet again, don't let them call her elder. It was too loud a title for an old lady who was easily grossed out, and the girl headed for the exit. The silhouette of a certain god, who was watching everything from the side and was very interested, appeared from the wall. The ghost flew around. He had learned too much, and now his head was stirring with strange thoughts. He asked the outsider if this guy was alive at all. It seems God feared for his ward. Meanwhile, Khan, still alive but very bruised, lay on the ground, covered by a leaf and breathing heavily. He had barely managed to get away from that damned village, and now the guy was lying somewhere in the bushes, trying to clean himself up. In the training room, the constant lessons continued. Alsus ushered all the students wanting to become swordsmen into the training room and showed his hand. The others opened their eyes in surprise. They didn't quite realize what was in front of them and froze in amazement. In front of them was a real banquet hall filled with a variety of exquisite dishes, and there was an incredibly pleasant smell everywhere. In the end, everyone sat down at a long table at the head of which naturally stood Alsus. The atmosphere was unusual for a swordsman, to say the least. The principal raised his cup and set about to toast, who decided to become fencers. The guards who were also standing there raised their cups and chorally recited the toast they were constantly talking, as if they were in the army. All the arriving students even twitched a little in surprise. The soldier spoke so loudly that it inspired fear. The commander of the knights frowned and held a cup in his hands. Suddenly, the prince offered to spar, to which the man gladly agreed. The principal asked the commander to demonstrate his swordsmanship, to which the man readily bared his blade and readied himself. The prince rushed forward. He jumped up like a bird and approached his opponent, swinging his blade. The blows and scraping of metal could be heard everywhere, and they moved like birds. It was obvious how high their skill in wielding cold weapons was. Everyone was surprised to see it was really a mesmerizing sight. No one expected to see such a level. The commander was putting out a full. However, even he felt some pressure from the prince. The man defended himself. Another pirouette, and then the blade flew out of the prince's hands. It was a good sword dance. The commander thanked the prince for the compliment, healing a small wound. The prince said that now he would show the real mastery of weapons and asked the commander to give his best. The man readied his blade and changed in his face. He would be more than willing to do this for his prince. Meanwhile, Alsus himself prepared his blade. His body was covered with energy that formed a kind of vortex the guy prepared. Meanwhile, the experienced fighter lunged at him, swinging his blade at him with a scream. A second later, the two rivals clashed in a duel. A deafening scramble was heard, and light flooded the room. Only one blow was enough for the commander's blade to break into several pieces. The man bent down on one knee and admitted defeat. However, the prince politely remarked that the commander's sword-wielding had gotten much better, to which the man bowed and thanked him. The students didn't even quite realize what had happened. They were turning their heads in different directions. Is this really the whole fight? Smiling, the prince said that a strike that will destroy any mastery of your opponent's weapon is the art of wielding a sword. The students glanced over. This is correct. So this is the art of weaponry that seeks to maximize efficiency. Smiled again, the prince said that this is exactly how they already understood the concept, and now let them drink the tea that stands before them. Kangmin was the first to take up the mug and tasted the drink after taking a few large gulps. However, the taste of this drink was surprisingly disgusting. Not at all like tea. Everyone started coughing. The knight explained that in order to learn this art, you need to get a warrior's blessing. This medicine will help you do it quickly and safely. After saying that, without further thought, Kangmin tipped the entire cup into himself and drank it in a gulp, even though it tasted disgusting. The boy even turned blue, but after wiping his mouth and putting it in his cup and back, demanded another portion. After looking at him, the prince said the guy would feel better if he ate some cookies and asked for another mug. The students looked at it with disgust, but still did not refuse. In the forest, Kang and his god were sitting in a tree with no monsters to cushion the fall, but he was able to survive thanks to the forest. The mercenaries who diligently pursued the guy while he was in the village left him no chance to escape. If the guard he'd bought hadn't opened the gate, who knows what might have happened? Probably the guy would have been finished. Sitting comfortably on a branch, the player noticed several gnolls walking in a small pack below and took a closer look, using their island of sniffing monsters, and started screaming that the meat was sitting in a tree. A smile appeared on the lad's face. After all, the monsters give him a nice, warm, welcome irony that these creatures deserve more than that. Pushing off the branch, Kang jumped down it. Just so happened that there was something he wanted to know, and now was his chance. A hard soul landed right on one of the creature's head, and the monster gritted its teeth in pain. In a few seconds, the entire small pack was already lying on the ground. Breathless, it was even too easy. Even Kang wondered, was it because there were only 3 of them somehow too easy? The god also looked at his ward in surprise. With open eyes, the guy felt his body like never before. She became much lighter. God constantly laughed at the fact that his wards did not know the word proportion, and the player, meanwhile, asked if he himself knew what he was talking about. The advice was as useless as possible. God said that naturally, the more the better. Kan grimaced and ironically thanked. The werewolf lying on the ground looked at him with a pitiful look and awaited his sentence to live. He wanted now more than anything. The player looked at him and said he wanted to ask him something. Just let him answer honestly. It's all because of the elves. He knows the truth. The werewolf immediately perked up. When he heard about the elves, he wanted elven meat. And when the player nodded his head, he immediately smiled. Khan explained that he'd recently found the gnoll's sword art that makes your hands blush and everything. How do they even use it? The guy meant Karmazin. In his mind, he still had the image of the goddess who had so treacherously exiled him to this cursed world in which he was now trying his best to survive. Now he is very weak. so it is necessary to at least imitate the skill that will help him survive here, at least so the player can become stronger. The werewolf kept saying something about meat, and Khan asked, what about the red eyes and all the other things? The werewolf kept licking his eyes. The werewolf nodded his head. He knew it well. It was the power of meat, the sweet elf he wanted to eat. Apologizing for his stupid question, the guy asked him how they ate. And most importantly, Monster kept going on about some kind of meat. Thinking about it, the player began to compare facts, sword art, strength, meat power. He needed more information to learn anything at all. Looks like he'll have to explore the habitat of these creatures. Meanwhile, the werewolf continued to cheer and breathe heavily. And at the same time, somewhere far away at a lavish table, there was a banquet going on. The prince was giving a lecture, and everyone was listening to him enthusiastically. He said that magic requires talent, but they have the time and money, so anyone can learn swordsmanship. No need to worry. All the other students listened to him with bated breath, while continuing to consume the strange drink. Kangman, who was already so drunk he could barely breathe, demanded more. The guy didn't seem to be taking care of himself at all. Smiling, the prince replied that for today, you can stop drinking this drink. The effectiveness of it drops when you drink a lot of it. At this point, the guy realized that he made a mistake, but he has to become stronger. Even though he is very disgusted, he has to become better than all these people. A teapot was presented to him, and someone's voice said he would feel better when he rinsed his mouth with honey tea. Looking at him, the prince smiled and said that consistency is very important. In one day, you can drink 1 cup or 2 if you are greedy. When the student heard about the 2 cups, he got excited. Naturally, he would try to do it and took the cup with tea and brought it to his mouth. Said that the warrior part is not something that can be achieved in a short period of time, just as a child cannot turn into an adult overnight. When Kangman heard that, he was horrified. He thought he would become famous pretty quickly, but it turns out his judgment was wrong. Moreover, the instructor said that this could only be achieved in a minimum of a year. Then the student's face turned red. A status window appeared in front of him. He was a hero without curses, and with standard characteristics the guy started to explore. The longer he fights now, the stronger he becomes. Clapping his hands, the prince congratulated the young apprentice. The blessing from the god of battle is no joke. He places great hopes on the boy. After that, Kangman was incredibly proud of himself. He had gotten exactly what he wanted, and now he had no right to let his teacher down. Putting his hands on the table, the prince said that first of all he would teach them how to hide their status window, because not everyone needs to show it. At this time in the woods, an enraged gnoll of anger, he was searching for meat like a search dog from the police officers. At last, he found his prey. It was a boar carcass, and the monster bit it with its powerful jaws. Meanwhile, the player continued to watch him. It had been a few days since he had researched his lifestyle to learn the power of meat. Suddenly, the monster stopped tearing up and looked at the boy with eyes hot with rage over his shoulder. As if surrendering to its animal instincts, the monster lunged at the boy, opened its clawed paws and roared, but Kang did not move. This dog tried to hunt him every time he ate his prey. Nice try, but failed. The guy kicked him. In an angry voice, the player told him not to crawl back upstairs. Strangely enough, this monster was too weak. The characteristics of this monster were almost all 0. It whined and fell to the ground. After that, Kang doubted that this beast was really a level 6 monster too low in stats for such a beast. He might be lying. However, the werewolf showed his biceps and said it was evidence elf meet head elf his hunt. Hearing that the player questioned his strength, the monster took offense. That's not fair, he thought he was strong. The boy asked if he could see his level. After thinking about it, the mutant said he can't see anything, but knows the meat of the first level, it's weak meat. Hearing such hurtful words, the boy approached him and gave him a powerful kick right in the jaw. However, after a few seconds, the monster immediately rose to his feet and started pointing his finger somewhere, saying that there were tons of elven meat. A smile appeared on the player's face, and he recognized the location of the village from which the elves who had ambushed him had come. Grabbing the carcass of a small rabbit, the monster opened its wide mouth. He said the elven meat was bad, and he stole. Kang just watched him from the side, while the monster continued to devour the rabbit, while continuing to crunch its bones. Yes, and besides, the player noticed changes in the body of this monster. As soon as the monster started eating something, the strength in its stomach gradually began to grow. The player approached his companion and asked him what he was pissing now, but only a menacing growl was heard in response. After a second, the werewolf rose to his feet and roared he felt incredibly good, with his body going through a strange metamorphosis. His fur became thicker and longer. His whole body turned red. He screamed that he needed much more meat, much more than he had now. And seeing the guy, a huge monster that became several times larger, rushed at him, he wanted to eat the talking meat. However, the player was against it. Smiling Kang thanked him. Now he knew how the power of meat worked, and there was no need for this monster. It only took one blow to split the monster in half. The guy's hands continued to burn red from the overabundance of energy. The werewolf was still alive and didn't understand how a talking meat could be so powerful. Turning back to the half-dead player, he thanked him, though it was not long, but it was very informative, and a smile appeared on Khan's face. He walked closer. His hands still continued to glow. Monster wondered, could it be that the talking meat was also of their bloodline? But no. The guy shook his head and said he was human. His eyes also lit up with the same bright red light, like two lights. The ghost appeared right beside the boy and looked very puzzled. He was telling him that this was the very power of meat that was spoken of. On the other hand, he pondered, if he didn't have the blessing, would he have survived the moment he used the power of depleted life energy? And here's an outsider's blessing. As soon as a player's powers are depleted, the blessing resets all negative effects. For a second, the player even thought it could be even cooler, but the ghost flying nearby began to reprimand him for such childish behavior. And so the two comrades rushed on. The matter was still full, so they had to hurry to make it in time. A few monsters were standing somewhere nearby and heard the smell of meat. They immediately became alert and prepared to hunt. However, Kang, running at them with all his might, hit one of the monsters with his fist right in the face. He scattered them like toys. Bok was very surprised at the transformation of his ward. He had become many times stronger in such a short period of time. It was frightening. But despite all this, that he got up much stronger than before, the player was not at all happy. He originally had to use his smartphone under a blanket. God pointed his finger somewhere to the left. The player thanked him and stopped for a second, choosing the right road. Taking his blade from his pocket, Khan prepared. His eyes lit up with rage. Should he now punish these barbarians with the power of fantasy? The two guards guarding the perimeter walked back and forth, talking in their own incomprehensible language. Only their voices could be heard. Kana's face appeared from the nearby bushes, and he had originally wanted to sneak in unnoticed, but the security here was better than he had expected. It was good that the guy was able to memorize the layout of the village earlier, so there was no problem with that now. The ghost, flying nearby, urged the guy to go right now and do not hesitate. Not a second was heard, only a slight chuckle. God insisted that it was time to move out and not sit still. The player wondered, is he really in a hurry to get somewhere? Why act so quickly? He didn't know what was on the creature's mind, but his instincts told him to do the same, and he jumped out of hiding. Stopping near the wall for a second, Kang paused and wondered if he could, but this was his chance, and he couldn't miss it. Hooking his sword into the wooden wall, he made a quick dash and swung over the fence in seconds. Once behind the wall, an interesting picture appeared in front of his face. It was an ordinary outpost with no one there, so it looked like he was lucky today. A blushing ghost tells him to be grateful, but Khan only grins grudgingly, of course. He is eternally grateful to his savior. His chest tightened, and now it was the moment of truth. It was time to change his life and become a better person. The doors opened, and a guard with a small beard appeared, wiping his hands and whistling to himself. A second later, the unsuspecting man felt something cold and sharp near his throat as Khan stood behind him. After a second, the guard's life was cut short. Very suddenly, blood spurted with incredible speed. The player massacred him. Looking at his work, Kang felt a little bitter about what he had done, but now he felt no difference between a human and a monster. These people would probably have those who mourned them, but still the player dragged the body of the guard somewhere far away. After all, he also had a family that was worried about him, but no one cared. The guard continued to stare with lifeless eyes. His chest became angry and his eyes became frantic because of those guys. Kang himself almost went to the grave early. The ghost looked at him with some challenge, but the player paid no attention to that and just continued his work. Soon, all the guards were lying in a single heap on the other side. If the missing so many people didn't anyone notice it. The player began to ponder. Infiltrating here certainly was fascinating, but so far he had only seen mercenaries. And where are the elves? The god continued to look down on his ward while the player pondered. Both humans and elves need a bathroom. Then where are the elves? The ghost was beginning to mock the boy for his low standards. The player asked him not to be so mean and to stop laughing. Suddenly, someone's talking in an unfamiliar language came to my ear, and from somewhere 2 people appeared, leading someone else. There were some familiar faces. I think one of them was Cole, and some other woman. They were leading 2 bound men with bags over their heads. Carefully looking out from behind the nearest shelter guy, thought what an interesting turn of events, and what to do now. The elfess was lying on her bed at this time and seemed to be asleep or was passed out. She suspected nothing. It was espresso. The girl didn't notice someone's hand moving towards her. She only opened her eyes in an attempt to realize something. The unknown kidnapper grabbed her by the mouth, preventing her from screaming, and she tried to break free, but nothing worked. The kidnapper whispered orders to her to shut up immediately or it would be worse, but only the moans and sighs of the unfortunate woman were heard. The 2 men started talking to each other. One of them asked where the scratch came from. The other said she had managed to bite him. After tying up the unfortunate elf, the kidnappers led her out of the hiding place. They had to get out of here as soon as possible, or they would be spotted. The kidnapper would nudge his victim and yell at her to go faster. The espresso disappeared in exactly the same way. Suddenly, a familiar voice came to her ears. It was the healer. The girl twitched and tried to break free, but it was no use. There were many more elves with the same sacks on their heads, and the healer kept talking. She said something about retribution. All this for letting their dear friend fight alone. Several humans stood before a group of bound elves. The man who snatched the girl screamed that he heard that the elves were against humans if they let them live. Then they would lose their families again. The bald man in armor said he ordered the others to stay inside since something is going on in the village. Even the mercenaries should not come out now. The girl with azure hair closed her eyes and said to start in her voice. There was some sadness and mute anger in her voice. The 2 men armed themselves with blades. They said it was all in the name of his fallen comrade, Karmazin. There was rage on their faces. The bald man was the first to strike with his blade. Blood spurted, and the elves tried to break free, but it was all useless. Espresso went to the other world with great suffering in her eyes, fear and tears, but the girl could do nothing. Finished with the rest of the elves, the 2 men said there was only one left and did not look in the direction of the elfess. It was the elder. Most importantly, because of the elves she began to speak, the girl was surprisingly calm, although she was tied to a chair. She asked if their goal wasn't to destroy her like the others in her eyes with anger and hatred. One of the men said he caught her while trying to leave the village. His companion said she was pretty high up in the hierarchy, and it was unknown what the elves would do. The elder said she understood how the people were feeling right now. There was pity and some sorrow in her voice. The image of the very savior who pulled her out of the basement of the crazy old man Karmazin appeared before her eyes and she felt warm. Destroying their savior in order to keep their secret infuriates the girl. The elf's voice became more defiant. The elder was promised that if she kept it a secret, she would be released, but the girl didn't agree. It's violence, and it won't work. The healer looked at the elder and asked in a calm voice why she was going so far. Even by lying, she would be able to escape. However, with a smile on her face, the elfess said that actually elves don't lie to save their lives. They are above that. Then they would have no choice. The man pointed the dagger at her and promised to do it as painlessly as possible so as not to make her suffer. He had already prepared to deliver the final blow. The elder froze in place and prepared to accept his fate. A few drops of blood fell on the elf's face. The girl was still alive, but she didn't understand anything. Looking up, she was surprised to see that the head of the very guard who had tried to destroy her was now flying through the air, and in front of her stood none other than the savior who had pulled them. Out of the scientist's basement, she didn't quite know what was going on. Kang looked at her with red eyes and said nothing. He had the very same knife in his hands. The elfess was frightened. There was still blood on her face, and fear glittered in her eyes. She couldn't believe her luck. Looking at her with red eyes, the player said that here they were meeting again, but there was something to do first. Turning towards the rest of the kidnappers, the player glittered his eyes. Should he deal with them first, so there would be no problems later on? He was going to destroy all of them, and the guy moved forward on the first kidnapper first blow, and the man is already lying on the earth. The girl sitting next to her covered her face with her hands and tried not to scream. She was incredibly scared. She was more afraid for her life than ever. Tears glistened in her eyes as she begged to be saved and spared, her voice breaking into tears. Great. The player now realized that he knew this language now. At least something could be understood. Now, the boy's eyes were burning red. The stranger got out of her seat and ran to the door. She tried to open it, but all was useless. Kang just stared at her from afar. A dagger whistled, and immediately it struck the head of the unfortunate woman. She parted with her life instantly. Meanwhile, the player stood and simply watched the result of his actions. He did not expect it to be so simple. Looking back, the guy realized that it was a good idea to start with a tough guy in armor, or there would be trouble. The elder looked at him with a surprised but not so frightened look, and said something, but the language was not clear. Turning to her, the player asked himself what she was talking about and continued to remain silent. Above the girl hovered a status window. She was an elder at the elves. The characteristics this girl had were really impressive. Getting closer, Khan realized he hadn't seen the status window before. Could it be that the elfess is showing it on purpose? Maybe she trusts him or something? Seeing the tamer's blessing, the player wondered if it was useless, even for the animals here anyway. There was only one reason to open the status. After looking at the elf once again, the player asked her name Celeblis. When she heard her name, the elven girl became animated and happy. A smile sparkled on her face as she looked at her savior with a grateful look. The player looked closer. Perhaps he felt nothing because of the outsider's curse, but it was all somehow strange. He looked at the elfess. Meanwhile, his deity was experiencing a lot of discomfort. He emphasized that the guy is an outsider and shouldn't throw around feelings like that. An irritated Khan said he already knows he's an outsider, and if he doesn't stay one for the rest of his life, he'll get punished right. The surprised elven woman looked at her savior and said something in her own language. Most likely she was asking. Still, what a lucky elf, the guy thought, because he wanted to destroy everyone in his path, but stopped for a second. He remembered how he had told his name to the inhabitants of this world who had betrayed him at the most crucial moment. It was his mistake. After all, the player untied the girl and told her to take care of the rest. He would be no different if he destroyed the elves here. A second later, the elder snapped out of her seat and ran toward the boy, as if wanting to hug him. However, the player reacted quickly and presented the blade to her chest. In an annoyed voice, Kang said that such antics really pissed him off. But the elven woman kept smiling and called him by his name, which surprised the player very much how she knew his name. There was nothing to do. I had to take her with me, and now the couple was walking down the night street, where it was suspiciously quiet. Kang wanted to ask his deity what he thought about it, but the outsider god was in no mood to talk. He seemed offended. Getting angry, the player said to himself that he needed to get rid of the elf so that this petty god would stop being angry for at least a second. But now they couldn't trust anyone. They stopped in the square and looked around for something nearby. Without thinking long, the guy grabbed the elf under his arm and ran away from the village. It was time to get away. All the way, the elf tried to say something to him, repeating the player's name. But Khan did not understand anything. Most likely she wanted something from him. When the guy asked what was wrong, the elf started to explain something to him, but the player still didn't understand a word. Still realizing that she wanted him to look up, Kang looked up and saw the flames covering the entire forest at an astonishing rate. But then it turned out that it was a phoenix. A huge firebird flew across the sky, leaving behind a hot plume. The player was frightened. In the end, the fire monster opened its wide mouth and shouted. This scream was so loud that one could be deafened. A second later, the fire phoenix fell to the ground, as if hit by someone's arrow. Most likely the bird had been wounded before. Kang thought for a second. Even if he wasn't injured due to his blessing, this frail elf could burn in a second. The elfess tugged at his arm and asked the player to let her go. She was tired of being in the hands of the player, Khan. As if he understood without words, it seems the elf wanted the guy to leave her since she considers herself a burden. Once she was on the ground, the elder began to slowly approach the phoenix. The bird seemed to show no hostility. The elder began to say something in her own language, and the bird tilted its head toward her and seemed to listen. It seems that the player began to realize that thanks to the tamer skill they became partners. The guy only watched it from the side. Turning to her rescuer, the elfess smiled and called his name, seeming to want him to come over. Turning to the boy, Celebes said something else in her own language and called out her name. It was basically understandable. She had something else to say or do. The player didn't quite understand, but the elfess moved closer to him and kissed him. The ghost, watching from the side, was shocked by the unexpected situation and didn't know what to say, but the player didn't seem to mind. Still pulling away from the elf girl, the guy wiped his mouth with his hand and tried to ask what she was doing. He didn't understand anything and was confused. But the elf only looked at him with a smiling look and squinted her eyes at him. She seemed to like it, a kind of gratitude. Suddenly, the phoenix began to envelop them with fire. The player looked in front of him with frightened eyes. He didn't realize what was happening around was getting warmer. The phoenix flew just a few centimeters away from the boy and pelted him with its heat. Khan tried to close in. A second later, the elven elder was already sitting on a firebird, seemingly unaffected by the fever. The girl once again called the player by name and looked at him good-naturedly. Most likely she was thanking him again for the rescue. The bird flapped its wings and flew upward, leaving the player standing alone on the ground in utter bewilderment. Having forgotten all about God, Kang felt someone pulling his hair. The deity sat on his shoulders and began to pass judgment. Not paying attention to the indignation of his god, the guy thought it was his first time. He couldn't believe that he was repaid with a kiss for saving him. Looking in front of him suddenly, the player saw a status window. Something there changed in front of him was a bright purple light. It turned out that his coefficient had increased, and besides the blessing of the god of the outsider, there was also an elf of high rank. The god continued to feel uncomfortable and eyed his ward suspiciously. He thought something was wrong. "Don't mind it," the player smiled and said that in life, things happen. He was very happy to be kissed and given a blessing. Now, God felt very uncomfortable. He seemed to be embarrassed, and the player kept looking at his status. Life expectancy and youth increased similar to the outsider's blessing. Now, if Kang uses both blessings, the power will increase. The god began to grumble that his ward was too happy the little creature seemed to be and pleased with the situation. Trying to appease his patron, the player said, the reason for his joy is that he and this elf finally separated. Of course, the guy collected. The deity stopped being angry for a second and silently looked at her ward with a spiteful look. But after a second, the little god sagged with joy. His condition improved greatly. Well, that's good. Kang was also glad it was over. Looking at the nearby bushes, the player asked his god if they should go any further. This time, there was silence. One of the werewolves was wandering through the forest, unsuspecting, his head spinning, looking for something to eat in the thicket. Suddenly, Monster felt someone jump on his shoulders, not expecting such a turn of events. I had a hard time guessing it was Khan. The guy smiled and asked how it was going. Monster looked at him, surprised and scared. A smile appeared on the boy's face. He kindly asked to be allowed to look around their house, and they moved on. It had been 3 days since the students had visited the academy, and now the teachers stood before the group of teenagers. The Prince Knights said that after meditating for a day, they would raise their levels on the hunt. Beside him stood the princess and smiled. Excitement appeared on the faces of the students, but the prince calmed down. For their first hunt, they will gather the necessary monsters here. The overjoyed princess exclaimed that for mages, blessing was definitely necessary. When the blessing rank and levels go up, the abilities grow. A few guys rejoiced at the level increase on the hunt, just like in their favorite fantasy novels. This is just great news. The girls started talking to each other. One of them had heard that, as the level increased, the skin and figure also improved, and they smiled. Suddenly, the curly-haired student noticed some strange creature behind him. It looked like a green-colored slug. He immediately exclaimed that it was slime. Everyone else also turned to the guy and started looking at the strange slime. Seeing such close attention to himself, the unfortunate liquid monster was frightened and tears spurted from his eyes. The teachers also saw the monster, and in one voice ordered all the students not to move. On the faces of the prince and princess appeared frightened. The curly-haired student was about to draw his sword to strike, but stopped in the same position when he heard the teachers shout. In a serious voice, Alsa said that they had correctly called the creature a slime, and it is useful. It does not harm humans, so it does not need to be destroyed. On the boys' faces showed disbelief. The slime couldn't be useful. They were upset that their experience had escaped them. The princess moved closer to the trembling blob and extended her hands to it. Thanks to this creature, the number of diseases is reduced. The guys looked amongst themselves, while the princess fiddled with the frightened slime. Was the students very sad? The girl hugged the little slime, and the monster smiled happily. She said that one should never attack a slime. Otherwise, even if they are heroes, they will be strictly condemned. Guys lowered their heads and nodded. They did not want to get caught in their first hunt. In a joyful voice, the prince stated that level 2 goblins would be perfect for them, but right now, their target was a level 4 null. Hearing the protocol of a serious opponent, the students were alarmed. Isn't it dangerous? This monster is much stronger than them. However, the princess hastened to reassure them on their side. Saint, if they left this world, they would be resurrected immediately, but that was no reassurance. The princess was approached by the prince and laughingly said that with the people here, they could even handle 6th-level orcs, so there was nothing to worry about. And so the hunt began, several werewolves snapping their toothy mouths at the students. Some of the newcomers were afraid, and some were overwhelmed with determination to get their long-awaited experience. The 2 guys were the first to rush straight at the monsters. Turnover did not run straight at them, see only their prey. The first student rushed forward and struck the monster with his sword. The werewolf roared with a wide mouth and struck back. The opponent was much stronger than the guy expected, and the student fell to the ground. Feeling the incredible pain, the claws went straight across his face. The huge beast stood right in front of the boy, lying on the floor and breathing heavily. He saw in front of him a piece of meat that he wanted to immediately devour. The unfortunate student, who expected nothing of the sort, was holding on to his wound and crying. He was incredibly scared and wanted to get away from here as fast as possible. The rest of the students suffered the same miserable fate. Monsters were incredibly strong and destroyed their victims one by one. One of the female students readied her magic cannon, and a fireball lit up in her palm. Apply her spell as the fireball exploded right in her hands, blinding the unfortunate for a second. She didn't understand why her magic wasn't working, but the other students had already rushed forward and shouted for her to look more closely. The failed sorceress began to cry and hiccup fearfully. She didn't expect her magic to be so useless. And the prince only stood and watched them from afar. Then everywhere were heard frightened cries and pleas for help. Eventually, the man got sick of it and said in a loud voice that enough was enough, his voice overlapping even the screams of the terrified students. Eager to end it all, swordsmen rushed forward and with one deft blow split the monster in 2. It was over in a second. The rest of the students were badly injured, some lying unconscious. They did not expect the first training session to turn out to be such ashes. Suddenly, a saint appeared and praised the prince for really working hard, teaching these students martial arts. The saint began to heal and resurrect severely wounded students, and the gods wondered if there was a reason to send these inept students into such difficulty. The first to be healed was a curly-haired student. The guy grabbed his chest, where recently there was a severe wound, and woke up. The saint looked at the others with a good-natured look and said that they had to fight until their last breath, or she would have to resurrect them all the time. The training continued full speed. Monsters were incredibly resilient. Guys were now acting more coherently. Kangmin put his hand on his classmate's shoulder and thanked him for buying time, but the guy didn't understand anything. Meanwhile, quickly moving forward, Kangmin put out his sword and prepared to attack the hated monster with a single strike. As the student approached the monster at a sufficient distance, he delivered a crushing blow with his sword right into the monster's stomach. A loud bang was heard, and the werewolf was thrown back by the powerful gust and flew far into the bushes, leaving a plume behind it. That was the true fighting spirit, and it worked. The werewolf lay motionless, seeming to have either gone to the afterlife or passed out. Opening the skill panel in front of him, Kangmin looked at his stats. Some of the gods praised him, and some called him cheap. Seeing that he had increased his level, the student rejoiced. Did it really happen so quickly? A smile appeared on his face. Looking at the other students who were cheering the victory, Kangmin realized that they were quite helpful. His lead was increasing with every second. The other 2 guys who were struck by Mion's charms fought with one monster too, but couldn't fight it. Eventually they succeeded, and the werewolf fell to the ground with an apt punch straight to the stomach and let out one last breath. Standing behind the 2 guys, Mion thanked them and showered them with her love. Thanks to these 2, she had reached the 2nd level. The other girls only looked at their classmate with disdain. They didn't like that she was getting so much attention from the opposite sex. Meanwhile, Beauty understood that beauty is also a weapon and skillfully used her skills to achieve her goal. Seeing that a certain innocent goddess was watching her intently, the student waved her hands in the fact that there was nothing illegal about it. Seeing that a certain bold beauty god was gazing at her and smiling lightly, Mion hesitated and immediately received a new blessing. Seeing in her status window the color of beauty is quite a useful skill, the girl rejoiced. This is just right for her. The same 2 students bravely put their hand to their chest and shouted that they would protect their queen, but Miyung only smiled lightly. The other guys, led by Kangmin, only looked at them from the sidelines and scratched the back of their heads. It turned out to be slightly strange. But suddenly the leader saw his subordinates leaving his team of guys, saying they would help him later. More recent friends went to Mion's place and it seems that these two guys were also influenced by her beauty. What's to say, and Kangmin himself recognized that it was pretty good, and moved forward, needed to unite. He walked over to the other two girls, who immediately realized he wanted to join and agreed they would help. Meanwhile, the gods watched their wards, and did not take their eyes off. They were very interested in watching these strange and very unusual characters. Meanwhile, Bora was desperately fighting another monster's. Girl flew aside, thrown away by a mighty gust. She was a loner, and had not had time to find company, so the water god looked at her with pity and sympathy. A huge werewolf holding a wooden sword approached the girl. The gods watched and grumbled. Rising to her feet, the brave girl assured herself that she would succeed, and boldly moved forward. A small flame lit up in her hands, and Bora tried to cast a spell to somehow destroy the monster. In a second, Ogon turned into a huge flame and headed straight for the monster the girl had succeeded. The huge werewolf roared in pain for a second, but immediately left this world leveled up. The monster was slain with a single blow. Bora, who was breathing heavily, sat down on the ground. She had finally obtained the second level, although it was difficult for her, but she had done it alone. Folding her hands in front of her, the girl cheered and blushed. She may not be the best among all, but it was a start. Bora rose to her feet. The water god calmed down a bit, and the god of battle cheered for the girl as hard as he could. He was amazed. As she studied her new weapon, Bora didn't notice the huge werewolf coming at her from the side, snapping its teeth at her. At the last minute, the girl skillfully reacted and thrust her sword forward, snapping her teeth just a few centimeters away. The monster roared and looked at his wound with burning eyes, fury glittering in his eyes. Bora tried very hard, and although with great difficulty, she managed to defeat the monster, the girl remained intact, even after the blow. The werewolf looked at his hand in surprise. He thought he had struck his victim, but she had not suffered any injury. Taking advantage of the moment, the student launched a huge fireball at him right in the head. Monster didn't expect it and roared. The next second, there was a cracking sound. A powerful swing of the sword separated the monster's head. From the body, another werewolf was defeated. And now the third level. Bora looked at her body and rejoiced. After all, she was able to defeat another one single-handedly. Meanwhile, along with the rest of the girls, Kangmin looked away with some displeasure and smiled. Miyun was standing there and looking at him. The guys who were enchanted by her were fighting for the attention of their goddess. On the cliff, at that time, stood two obscure silhouettes and watched everything from above without saying a word. It was the principal along with the princess. They were no longer directly involved in teaching, but just watching the students cope. A very strong hand held onto the mouth of one Null. The monster was breathing heavily and trying to break free, but it was all to no avail. Kang had already killed many of these monsters by entering their habitat, but there was still more to come. A certain god asked if the player was interested in how many he destroyed. Turned out to be less than a few thousand, still bad. Sitting down on the body of one of the defeated monsters, the guy missed his head. He checked the status window over and over while fighting, but the level didn't rise. It was now that the player was sure he couldn't level up because of his curse of being an outsider, most likely. His divine companion was concerned, however the player hastened to assure him that everything was fine. It was all possible due to the curse of the evil goddess. His level isn't rising at all. Kang is furious. He's trying so hard to make progress, but it's all just futile. Suddenly, God looked into another galaxy and said that the stars there are surprisingly very many stars. The player wondered why. Kang thought the god would start bullying him again, but not so. However, the ghost just looked away and smiled. There was only one question: what kind of curse? The player was thinking about how to fight it, and what can be done in such a situation. Realizing that he was really being forced to become an outsider, Kang lowered his head, but God was overjoyed. Suddenly, the guy's eye caught on some strange, shiny bracelet on the paw of one of the monsters, and the player took a closer look. Looking at his already full purse, the player thought he was trying not to steal too much, but still. He took the bracelet off the monster's hand. Most likely it was from humans or elves. If Kang can't level up, the only way to get stronger is money. Suddenly, a growl was heard from somewhere, and a few more armed monsters appeared. Now they were afraid of the guy and wanted to destroy him. Turning his head to the side, Khan wondered if there were still gnolls here. He thought he had exterminated all the gnolls in the area, but it turned out that he hadn't. It turned out that one of them was the leader. His name was Hook, who made the elves cry. He was level 9 and had serious equipment. The player prepared to attack it. Seems these monsters came here with a plan to destroy him, thinking to take a numerical advantage. Without giving it much thought, the crowd of monsters moved straight at the defenseless player, thinking that they would overwhelm him and defeat him. With a deft move like a circus performer, the guy jumped aside and one of the monsters missed. Eyes lit up and a dagger gleamed in his hands. Kang was very happy that such good teachers had come to teach him themselves. Seeing a familiar skill, monsters were surprised. Is this meat? Gnoll monsters looked at the player surprised and frightened eyes. While the werewolves were discouraged, Kang easily destroyed one of them and started on the other. A real massacre. Sighing heavily, the hero mentally thanked these monsters. Thanks to them, he had figured out how to use this power effectively. In trembling voices, the monsters shouted that the meat was too strong and needed to run away. They wouldn't be able to handle this man. Putting his sword on his shoulder, the smiling Kang said that no matter how many monsters they called for help, it wouldn't be enough. Eventually, he managed to collect a whole ton of gold. All that was left was to figure out how to get it to the nearest merchant to sell it. Upon reflection, the player realized that if he couldn't sell all these things for a decent price, then they were no better than regular stones. Need a translator. In principle, it was possible to trust these werewolves because they could not lie, and the player sat there thinking as he suddenly heard someone's voice. A strange man with horns on his head, looking like a demon, appeared from the forest thicket, wondering who had taken care of all those monsters. Turning to the stranger, Kang raised an eyebrow in surprise. Did he really understand his language? The demon wanted to say something else, but suddenly the player grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and pulled him to him. The demon screamed what he was doing, but the player happily slammed his eyes shut and caught the translator. Making crazy eyes, Kang asked his name and immediately expressed the thought that they could be friends. The stranger gritted his teeth and said that he was a demon, not a gnoll, with a grimace of anger on his face that some human dared to attack him so openly. After this statement, the player was very surprised. Khan thought that demons are powerful humanoids, and it turned out not. The kidnapping goddess said that the target is the Demon King, defeat the Great Lord. Looking at the strange demon, the guy thought that if even the gods have to ask for help from the foreigners, then the demons are very strong. It seems that this strange man could read minds and immediately took offense to the belief that demons are strong only prejudice. Not expecting anything like that, Kang apologized. He felt guilty for a second for insulting this kid for no reason. But all was too late. The demon was already sobbing bitter tears, and the player tried to apologize to him, although I did not understand why he is such a crybaby. The demon was very frightened. He asked the player who he even was and why he was so abnormally strong, what was wrong with him in the first place. With a smile on his face, in a benevolent voice, Kang replied that everything was due to his blessing, which the unique demon still couldn't believe. When he found out that the demon could see his curse, the guy was very surprised to find out how it was possible that he didn't show his status window. Pointing to his green eye, the demon replied that he had the blessing of observing the eye that allowed him to see the abilities of others. Spirit watched it all from the sidelines and smiled. It was amusing to watch the demon fear his ward. Taking a closer look, the player said that this demon was quite intelligent, to which he replied that he was a black mage and had been for quite some time. And besides, let the guy not compare him to the humans even before he was born. The demon was fit to marry. The little god seemed interested in the creature and insisted on learning more. The boy shook the demon and asked him why he had not married long ago, to which he replied that he just wanted to be destroyed. He did not want to be a toy in the hands of man. A smile appeared on Khan's face. Wouldn't it be sad to leave this world without getting married? However, the unfortunate man replied that the stronger the demons are, the more partners they have, but he is a weakling, and ran away from his settlement. Looking at him with a pitying look, the guy started to pity him. However, the demon asked him to stop it, humiliatingly. Oh, and by the way, how can a player even walk this question from the demon? Sounded a little strange. A little surprised, the player let go of the demon and asked what he even meant, why it was he shouldn't walk. However, the demon pointed to a bottle of paralyzing potion. He had used almost all of it, but this man somehow still walks. The image of a mad scientist who acted in the same way in principle, but the effects of the poison were not at all perceptible, immediately came to mind. But when Kang found out about it, he got angry. He wanted to be friends with the devil, and he tried to paralyze him. Seeing such a frightened expression on the demon's face, he didn't want to mess with this abnormal guy. But a smile was already spreading across the player's face. By itself, the demon was able to remind him of such an invigorating incident that had happened not long ago. The player laughed as he approached the demon, thus scaring the hellspawn. But suddenly, a wave of some strange energy spread throughout the boy's body and paralyzed him as if to paralyze him, but the obsession quickly subsided. This made the player even more furious, and what this little demon is up to, does it want to destroy him? Even that didn't work. The curse of the outsider nullified the effect of the binding potion, and they remained in the same position. After a little thought, the player asked the question that this demon is connected to the headman. It is possible that they somehow cooperate. The demon only smirked and asked what kind of stupid questions these were. He seemed to have calmed down a bit. The demon said that this man was on the verge of life, very old and infirm, and passing near the demon seemed to pity him because of the sad story. That's why he saved him from the elf's curse. But a second later, some kind of energy passed through the demon's entire body that made him shudder. Now everything became clear. The player realized that the black mage was that demon because of him, and everything happened. Fury overwhelmed him so much that the player was ready to destroy anyone in his path. Eyes lit up. The sight was terrible. Meanwhile, during the training session, there were only a few students left. Unfortunately, the others couldn't take it. The saint stood before them, and putting her hand to her lips, looked pityingly at them. They returned to the temple. Now the funds will be invested in the remaining heroes. All the other students heard this and were ecstatic. It was just great news. The prince is also very happy. 3 levels in a day. This unprecedented rate of increase is simply wonderful. The man was delighted. As expected from the hope of humanity, all indeed delightful to himself, he thought, although surprised only by the hero's blessing. Suddenly they were interrupted by some guard who rode in on a horse, saying he had a report. They saw a monster in the process of being eaten. The man was very frightened. His voice was shaking. He was out of breath and wanted to say something else, but stopped. The saint turned to him and asked, "At what stage is the monster?" Man, breathing heavily, replied that it was at the 5th. Turning toward the prince, the girl asked those 3 heroes also on the same level. The man nodded in response. An idea came to mind. And now all the remaining students, led by the prince, moved forward to the monster. There was something to check. Hiding behind a nearby tree, the whole group watched as the huge wolf sat and ate something. Only its vile slurping could be heard. In a whisper, the prince said that monsters may look stupid, but it is not at all true. He can attack someone who is less powerful. The princess, who appeared next to her, joyfully announced that the fed-up monster could even use black magic. She spoke too loudly. Naturally, the huge, furry beast heard her voice and became alert. It seemed that the new prey was not long in coming. The princess, with a silly look, apologized and said that it seems they were discovered through her fault, but it was too late to apologize. The huge, furry monster roared at the group of students with the intent to destroy them and devour every last one of them. The prince said they would stay behind and watch the students deal with this monster. This is their main assignment. People were very scared. They didn't know if this monster was all right, and if it was even possible to deal with a monster of this level. But using his leadership skill, Kangman turned to the boys and said that there was no need to be afraid. If only to gain time, it would be possible to defeat this monster. Since this wolf is bigger, he should in all likelihood be slower than the others, so that could be an advantage. The boy wanted to say something else, but he didn't notice that a huge, angry wolf was already flying at him, opening its wide maw. There was a rumbling sound, and all the other students froze. They had not expected such a quick attack, and had goosebumps running down their backs. A second later, the huge beast rushed at the other students and started throwing them around like toys. People didn't know what to do. Fear possessed them. Bora prepared herself. She still managed to control herself and grouped herself quickly to avoid tragedy. The monster was standing right in front of her with its back turned, giving the girl a chance to make a sneak attack. She immediately started swinging her sword, the energy overflowing her weapons. The blow could only be one she had to act carefully and very quickly. But unfortunately, the werewolf immediately noticed the attacker and hit the girl with a knee right in the stomach, so that she was bent in half. Unable to match such power, she flew backwards and crashed into her classmate, which was very painful. The monster looked at her with eyes burning with rage and tried to shake her, but it was useless. She was passed out, and a frightened Miyung was holding her head and trying to bring her to her senses. The monster was approaching them. With a trembling voice, the girl begged anyone to help her. She was very scared. The monster was approaching slowly, as if mocking them. The huge monster stared at its victims with eyes hot with rage, its mouth dripping with vile saliva with only a few seconds to go. Two girls were sitting downstairs, shivering in fear. One of them was passed out and could not help her useless friend in any way. The frightened Mion prayed and asked at least some god to help her. She really didn't want to part with her life. But suddenly something changed. The monster changed its face and moved closer to the girl. It seems the charm worked even on the monster. He moved a couple more steps closer to her. There were only a few seconds left before tragedy struck, but suddenly a powerful blow struck the monster right in the neck and separated its head from its body. It was the principal. He arrived in time and saved the two girls. Looking at his students, the man asked if they were all right. Miyung was so scared that she couldn't speak properly. Only sobs came out of her mouth as she shook with fear. The tutor only looked at her with a pitying look, seeming a little disappointed with the students' progress. Meanwhile, somewhere far away on a forest edge, an unfortunate demon was suffering humiliation at the hands of a strange, strong man. His eye was swollen and his nose broken. Khan had tried very hard, and now the demon was barely alive. The poor man looked at his tormentor with a piteous gaze and had already resigned himself to going to the next world. Looking at his victim with a good-natured look, the player asked if he wanted to part with his life. Demon shouted for him to finally wait. His hand glowed, and it was as if he had begun to heal himself with his own magic. Soon, all the wounds healed, and the demon's face took on a normal appearance, seeming to feel better as a smile stretched across his face. This ability was very similar to Outsider, and the player noticed it immediately, but was still very angry. It was no joke. The demon said there's a terrifying saint in the next settlement. And besides, he can't say goodbye to life without getting married. With a smile on his face, the demon offered to guide the boy to the next town. Exactly where he would find what he needed. There were many people there. The happy player agreed that it suited him after all. The method of communication works. It was only worth the effort. And so they went on their way. On the way, the demon said that the knights have been guarding the main entrances for several days, so they would have to go around. Hearing about the identity check, the player became furious. All because of this language barrier, the cursed goddess is putting a stick in his wheels. Meanwhile, his annoying little side continued to have fun. He seemed to like it when his ward suffered. It was getting more and more annoying. Two more heroes, Hanu and the red-haired mercenary, were walking along the forest road. The girl kept grumbling. Meanwhile, the badass was always thinking about toilets that weren't mentioned in the comics. That's what he was trying to say. But for these few days, the girl had paid for his armor in and food, so it would be unfair to resent him. Suddenly, the mercenary stopped and sighed heavily, probably because something was bothering her. Turning to the player, the girl said she was concerned. One thing that has been bothering her for days now is that the guy has been looking too intently at her from behind. Hanu sighed and replied that it was a simple misunderstanding. He just likes to go behind, that's all. And inside himself, the guy rejoiced such a hottie helps and follows. The stranger must be the effect of blessing the main character's buff. But the mercenary didn't stop being angry. She moved closer to the boy and angrily said she was very surprised when the boy started attacking the slime. Pointing a finger at him, the girl said that in any case, this is where the orc territory starts from here. In a normal situation, the guy would be on the run for the village. The girl said that orcs were more dangerous than werewolves, so be careful not to leave the forest. She wanted to make sure that the bastard understood everything and asked again. The mercenary was breathing heavily. She was extremely displeased. Hanu, however, said he remembered everything perfectly and smiled broadly once again, pleased that such a beautiful girl was worried about him. The mercenary continued to glare at him incredulously, and the guy smiled like a madman. The player noticed that the number of gods watching him had increased. Did he really become so popular, even in the divine pantheon? The mercenary said with a heavy sigh that he had better not be a nuisance, but a guardian of the Knoll territory. And besides, Hanu was the lowest mercenary of the slime level, the lowest rank among mercenaries. But still, the guy looked down at his ring on his finger and cringed a little. He had a new blessing, giving extra experience. Turning around, the player asked if the girl was sure that this was the right place. The mercenary noticed it too. Coughing, Hanu said that such incidents always happen when the protagonist goes. He whispered it under his nose. This is the problem. The mercenary revealed the map with the task she had thought they would quickly handle such an order and bring 5 right Knoll ears. Dreamily looking in all directions, the player said that then we should go deeper into the forest, but the girl said that it's not that easy to start by looking around. Looking at her with a smiling face, Hanu said to calm down and trust him. Everything will be fine, so nothing to worry about. Looking at him, the mercenary wondered if he was so confident, but suddenly the girl shrieked and told him to be careful. And really, there was nothing to be afraid of. The guy just turned his head, and the first thing he saw was a sharp axe blade flying straight at him. The monster noticed the prey. Eventually, at the last moment, Hanu was able to bounce aside, and the huge axe flew, literally, near his body a few centimeters away. The guy was frightened beyond belief. He looked at the huge axe a few centimeters away from him, and dazed with fear, did not dare to move. Thank God the mercenary quickly oriented herself and yelled for the guy to come to his senses. Finally, she ran to help her ally. Jumping up high, the girl prepared to attack the monster. From high up, the werewolf was already preparing, and raised its bloodshot eyes upwards. The sound of a blow rang out, but the armor the werewolf wore was too strong to be broken by a simple sword. The mercenary landed a few centimeters away from the guy and asked if he could get up, but Hanu didn't move, yet he was too scared. Meanwhile, the huge ogre monster was approaching them, his saliva dripping from his mouth, and his wrenching growls could be heard everywhere. The player finally realized that he was facing the same gnoll, but he seemed a little more intimidating than the boy knew from the novels. Worst of all, there were two werewolves, and they were already running at their victims, waving huge blades. Eventually, the mercenary realized that it was useless to expect anything from this guy and said to listen to her carefully. Her voice became firm. She said she would somehow get the attention of the monsters, and Hanu at that point should try to run away. The guy didn't want to leave her behind. He wanted to say something else, but something flew near his face and hit him painfully right in the jaw, and he almost lost consciousness. It was a huge, massive rock that flew right into the player's face, and his head went all fuzzy. The last thing the player heard was the fierce scream of the mercenary who tried to bring him to his senses, but it was useless. Only a few seconds passed, and luckily Hanu was able to regain consciousness. He opened his eyes and sighed heavily. He looked up, and the first thing he asked, what was wrong with these monsters? The player was very scared and was twirling his head in different directions. The first thing the guy saw was his friend, who was missing her left arm and was tying her hand with another tourniquet. After what he saw, the player could not find words to express his surprise. He did not quite understand what happened to his hand. However, the girl with a sad look said that you shouldn't blame yourself, it was her mistake, so Hanu is not to blame for anything. However, the player berated himself for making such an oversight, and how can he be called the protagonist after this? This is a real shame. Wanting to do something to help his friend who had protected him, Hanu opened the inventory panel and searched for some potion to restore his arm. He paid no attention to the attempts to calm him down. How could anyone stay calm after something like this? It was unthinkable. Again, the special effect worked, and the girl smiled, saying it was her fault, so it was okay. Seeing the expression on her companion's face, the mercenary looked at him in surprise. When he heard the gods laughing at him, the player shouted for them to shut up, but the mercenary only looked at him in surprise. The wind god was not happy with this attitude to himself and decided to teach the guy a little lesson by hitting him with a lightning discharge. He can't see through objects, and his ability to keep a secret is reduced. The mercenary looked at him surprised. Through the clothes, the guy could no longer see. There were only crosses. After such, Hanu was inconsolable. He began beating his fists into the ground in an attempt to regain his gift. All dreams went to ruin. The mercenary understood nothing. The girl calmed down and suggested that if they stayed here like this, they might get into trouble. As the companion began to speak, the mercenary looked at him with a surprised look. He promised her something. In a firm voice, he said that he would take responsibility and fix her hand because he is the hero of the legends of Kanu, was fully confident. Meanwhile, Kang continued to ask his new friend what his name was, wanting to know who he was dealing with. The demon answered that his name was Kogmo. The hero still didn't believe that it wasn't some kind of alias, but the new acquaintance claimed that it was a common name. Yes, and besides, he is the 23rd child of the 348th wife of the 14th demon lord, the player wondered. Demons said that people attach great importance to status, and all that, in the society of demons, can rule anyone here. There is no such prejudice. Smiling Kong said that in the end, it turns out that this demon is a nobody, and his name is no one. Even the name does not need to be memorized. But the demon seems to be very upset. He sat down and almost cried. The player immediately began to apologize. Leaning over, he said that his nickname was Mos, so called by his old friend, she became a wife. That's the story. Mose couldn't even congratulate her after the birth of her firstborn, and it makes him very sad, and he blames himself for it. He wanted to say something else, but he cut himself off halfway through. Khan looked at him, still smiling, but he felt bad. For a second, the guy felt sorry for him. This demon had his own history of obsessing over marriage, but the two of them had different stories. Meanwhile, God began to beg to pass this boring forest faster. He longed for activity rather than treading in one place. The player noticed that God was not pleased when Khan interacted with humans or elves, wondering why he reacted that way to demons. Leaning even lower, Moss looked closer, his face more serious. He said he was finally here. In front of them was a huge trail of some animal or huge man, apparently very heavy. The demon said that this was the place where they could finally leave the forest. Sounded great, but they shouldn't let their guard down. Besides, now the travelers were in orc territory, and these monsters are quite dangerous, much more dangerous than werewolves. However, the player did not seem to lose his fighting spirit. He hoped that among these guys will be good guys. Demon only smirked. Squinting his eyes in a serious voice, Moss said that the orcs were much stronger than the werewolves they had met before. If you look closely, you can see them there. The player squinted, but so far he didn't see anything. Perhaps they were too far away. One of the orcs walked. At the very foot of the cliff on which the travelers stood, he looked rather ordinary. It didn't take long for the others to show up as well. There were a few orcs. Also, they knew how to breed animals, so that was pretty unusual. The orc closest to him started sniffing with his pig snout and shouted that he smelled a human. The others also sniffed and said that whether I teach I am a man, they are not as tasty as women, but at least you can satisfy your hunger. Mose shouted that it was Khan's player's fault and didn't quite understand what he was being accused of. However, the thing was, the guy's eyes were glowing just like Noel's, and it hadn't occurred to him that these things could glow in the dark. And for sure, the player had completely forgotten. And used to it, the demon looked at him with a surprised look. How could one forget it all? The eyes stopped burning, but that didn't fix the situation. The orcs had already spotted them, and the demon rampaging about could have hidden them earlier. But it looked pretty cool, which the player immediately said Mose was furious and called him a fool. In front of them, a dozen orcs had already gathered. In the meantime, they were quite large and twice as big as the average human. Looking closer, the player noticed that they behaved quite calmly. So far, there was nothing to worry about, but who knows what will happen next. Demon noticed that this is also Kana's fault. Orcs have traded and plundered, so they know the price of reward. Don't underestimate them. Ignoring all the warnings, Khan jumped off a large cliff and said he would try to talk to them. Maybe there would be many normal ones among the orcs. Mose kept muttering to himself, but the player had already jumped to the bottom in front of a dozen orcs. He was about to turn to them, but suddenly one of the orcs called him a skinny pig, which was quite offensive. They demanded to give them everything they had, but Khan just stood there and smiled at them. A huge orc came up to the boy and asked him if he didn't know the pig language, to which Khan said he was human. The orc thought of the pig was the talking orc, or as it seems, the monster didn't understand anything. They began to talk among themselves. The stranger spoke their language. The skinny pig was smart. They demanded to give everything they had. Sighing heavily, the player thought that these guys seemed more talkative and eloquent than the werewolves, but they weren't as smart. Taking out his blade, Khan offered the orcs the opposite of giving everything he had. The monsters stunned and looked at him. The nickname Pig really offended the orcs, and they looked at the boy with red eyes with fury. Without waiting for an answer, the player jumped on one of the huge orcs and plunged his blade right into it. The rest of the orcs came. In horror, they did not expect that some weak human could defeat one of them. It was terrifying. However, the guy was no longer stopping. These were his words, so it would be better to immediately find out who is more suited to the pigs, him or the orcs after all. Not half a second later, a sharp blade stabbed into the head of one of the orcs, and he immediately went to the other side of the world. Orcs did not understand what was wrong with this pig, but no matter was not the time for unnecessary questions, had to deal with the enemy as soon as possible. A few orcs started bickering instead of catching the annoying kid, and meanwhile, the player was minding his own business. The boy turned his head toward the two monsters and looked at them with burning eyes. The situation looked interesting. The demon Kang came up to him and immediately asked if orcs were stronger than werewolves. Mose nodded his head. It was just that this guy was weird. After a while, the orcs were done with. It was easy, even easier than the player thought it would be. Looking at his demonic companion, the guy said that if he wanted to accompany him, he should at least help a little. When Kang looked closer, he noticed that the demon was doing something strange. His legs were engulfed in flames, and it looked very strange and incomprehensible. The player was surprised and a little scared. It looked pretty dangerous. The guy still decided not to get close. The demon, writhing in pain, hissed through gritted teeth for Kang to look up at the sky where something strange was happening. Above them flew some kind of monster that looked like a dragon or a horse with 4 wings. It was incredibly large and completely white. Taking a closer look, the player wondered where it was he was headed, and the burning demon was shouting that a saint was flying on this dragon. Turning to his companion, Kang asked in surprise, "Is it really the saint?" In a hissing voice, the demon confirmed that it was. He looked pitifully in front of him, as expected of the world weapon of humanity, to detect it from a distance and so accurately strike. Luckily, Moss was able to avoid a tragic fate, but met one of only 2 saints in the whole world. How lucky he was after all. The demon continued to say something, but Kang looked at him with a surprised and frightened look. The lower part of the demon was almost completely burned. But the demonic companion said that such wounds are nothing to him, but the player will have to carry him on his back while he can't walk. Looking at his comrade with a surprised look, the player replied, "No, why would he carry a demonic carcass on his back?" But everything turned out a little bit wrong all the same. Had to carry Mosa all the way. The player grumbled under his breath. He did not even have to carry his parents. And then there was that little pushy god who kept saying that we should feed this demon to the orcs. Kang grimaced and felt extremely bad. Hearing this, the demon said it was mutual. If someone found out he was helped by a human, the chances of getting married would be no higher than 0. Hearing such great news, Kang said that once he got out of here, it would spread the rumors as far as possible. The demon looked at him. Upon learning that this guy had almost become a hero, most looked fearfully at his savior and cried out in fear. He looked at the demon and raised an eyebrow, asking if he had seen his status. But that's the thing, he had, and the curse is only given by a demon. The thing is that when you lose a hero, is given the hero's curse, because it slows down, the level increase in that revenge becomes impossible. Now it was becoming clearer. The guy asked if that meant the demon couldn't evolve. And all the while, sitting on the boy's back, the demon wondered how an inferior human like him could have received the elf's blessing. It was impossible. Continuing to rage, most did not understand, and some curse outsider player said that if the demon continues to spin, he will fall. Upon thinking about it, the imp realized he had never heard of the curse of the outsider, though he had gathered a lot of information from around the world. Though Naum something comes up, the player chose to remain silent, though it certainly was a very bad feeling when someone is looking at your window for someone else. Looking at the player with an incredulous look, Maus once again asked why his wounds disappear as if they never existed. Such a skill would be cheating. Without turning his head, the player said that this was indeed the case, and as the demon, of course, did not know what an outsider was, but it was more of a curse than a blessing. No matter how much experience the player gets while destroying monsters or completing quests, it's all offset by the fact that points are reset. And so, the guy can never raise his level no matter how hard he tries. It's unfortunate, but there was no way out. And after these words, a little thought. And it sounded very interesting. The guy even stopped for a second. The demons said that now Kang would be able to become stronger, even in spite of everything. And now, when the player thought about it, it became more and more interesting. Meanwhile, God was flying somewhere nearby and trying to ignore the conversation between the two, although Demon's words made sense. For some reason, God became very sad and sighed heavily. Heavy thoughts filled his head along with memories. He recalled his past. The player looked at him from afar with a kind of pitying look, though he didn't understand anything. Right now, the training center was gloomy. One of the students was furious. Why are they legendary heroes with a lot of power constantly failing? Kangman was sitting next to him. He said that he wasn't the only one defeated, so let him stay calm and don't disturb others. However, the student was not going to calm down. He wanted to say something else, but hesitated at half a word, and silence reigned. The prince came into the room with a good-natured voice. He said that there was no need to be upset. A well-fed werewolf was much stronger, but it could be defeated by leveling up. The frustrated students had to agree, because these are the teacher's words, and he knows what he's talking about. Suddenly, the commander of the army entered the room. He reported that they had failed to find traces of the mercenaries who had destroyed the werewolves. The prince asked what hypotheses. Handing him the scroll, the man informed him that perhaps it was the actions of a famous mercenary squad on the experts were sure that it was a knightly order. The prince opened the reports and started reading, while the chief continued. The techniques of using the sword on all the monsters were identical. This is quite strange. Making one strange assumption, the prince immediately faltered and dismissed the unnecessary thoughts. It could not be the actions of a single intruder, that's all. The army chief asked what about scouting. The prince replied that with their current plans, the task would be a bit difficult. They continued their conversation as suddenly someone's heavy sigh was heard. Someone was in a great hurry. In front of them stood Hanu. The guy was very out of breath and couldn't string a few words together. The prince immediately turned his head in the direction of the comer, and a slightly startled man tried to realize what had happened. On the doorstep stood Hanu, holding his mercenary friend on his back, who was already in a bad way, the skin on her face turning blue. At least somewhat recovering his breath, the traveler shouted in a loud voice that he needed Saint, and immediately had a real nightmare on his face. For a second, there was silence in the hall. The prince, along with the army chief, just stood in their seats. The students began to chatter. They recognized this kid, but didn't he leave to train alone? So what's he doing here? Meanwhile, Hanu kept shouting in a low voice. He heard that the saint had returned to the temple. So where is she when you need her so badly? With a slight grimace, the principal asked the hero to watch his manners a bit and not to communicate in such a tone. The guy realized that he made a mistake and immediately apologized. He wanted to say that because of him, a man got hurt, but got a little busy when he saw the guard behind him. The princess, who was just beside her, shrieked in surprise and covered her mouth with her hand. She seemed to recognize this girl. The hero put the mercenary on her feet. The girl smiled and said that she is a simple mercenary, though thinking of retiring and going back. The princess, continuing to be surprised, covered her mouth with her hand. Coming out, this girl is going to come back. Looked like they are old acquaintances. The mercenary sighed heavily and looked around guiltily. She wanted to explain what had happened. A frightened Hanu asked the princess to finally call a saint and heal this girl. It was too noisy, someone shouted, and the saint appeared and immediately asked in a businesslike voice what was going on here. The prince was the first to answer. He said that the hero Hanu had returned. Everyone froze in place. The boy was about to say something, but a second later, 2 spears appeared in front of him, blocking his way. Hanu was afraid. The guard, dressed in armor, in a stern voice, told the lad to remain standing there, but the unfortunate man begged him to listen. Despite being level 1, so also cursed, the guy said he had found a wonderful comrade and looked around guiltily. The saint looked at the red-haired girl whose name was Arya. She had some pretty impressive features. However, Saint still doubted whether it was enough to call such a girl wonderful. A doubt appeared on her face. Hanu kept shouting. He said that this girl had protected him at the cost of her life, but it seemed the saint wasn't paying attention. The saintess held out her hand and asked, "Does the guy here see priests and knights above level 30 who would sacrifice lives for the good of humanity?" And then the hero realized in what trouble he was in. No one is not going to listen to him here. To him already approached the knight who was going to escort him out of here. Hearing the question of how wonderful this particular girl was compared to them, Hanu was stunned that this was such a question he did not know how to answer. Everyone else continued to watch from afar. Hanu said she had a pure heart, but that wasn't enough. Eventually, the guy couldn't take it anymore and yelled across the room that she had huge potential. Arya looked at him with a surprised look, and Saint calmly replied that she was sure that in a few years, this girl would be a fine lady. Hanu looked frantic and agreed, but he talked about her talent. She did have a wonderful talent. Looking at him with a disdainful look, the saint said that while Guy was standing on the 1st level, some had managed to get to the 6th level. That was the talent, but the player didn't want to give up. He looked at the saint with frantic eyes and seemed to hate her now with all his soul. Everyone else in the room also looked at their former comrade, but still remained silent. Now, instead of his friends, Hanu saw monsters who looked with eyes full of hatred. They still remembered the circus he had made when he left. The saint looked down at him once more and asked, "Does he have anything else to say, or is that all there is to say?" And the voice was metallic and indifferent. Gathering his thoughts, the unfortunate guy desperately shouted that Arya is his special mate, and he begs for her hand to be healed. But the saint, without the slightest tremor in her voice, refused. Why should she pay for the debt of this unfit student? The girl crouched down on her knees in front of him and affectionately called him by his name. He didn't realize the significance of her magic. The saint wanted to say something else. She even went to a whisper, but suddenly the priest interrupted her with a loud shriek. He shouted that the nation of elves, for saving her elder, would like to present the following for the benefit of the saint: 15 spirit swords containing forest magic, 200 bows from the moonlit sky, 600 tamed unicorns, and 15 phoenix feathers, as well as 4 dozen other especially valuable items. Hearing this, the other students opened their mouths in surprise. The saint looked at the hero with a sympathetic look and told him to realize that this is exactly the value of her magic. Now can he prove his? Unwilling to back down, Kanu shouted for Saint to see it as an investment he would become better and stronger. But the woman did not even want to listen to anything she said, that in this case the conversation will have to be postponed. Unhappy guy fell to the floor. He was reprimanded in front of everyone, and he ran away so fast and acted like he knew everything the guy was embarrassed. Everyone circled around him and began to stare judgmentally at Hannah. The guy sat there and didn't dare raise his head. He was incredibly embarrassed. The unfortunate hero wanted to justify himself and even opened his mouth for this purpose, but the deities lie. This is bad. Suddenly, the hitherto silent Bora asked if she could make this girl her comrade. Saint looked at her over her shoulder. For some reason, this girl is an outcast amongst her own, but she has huge potential, so what to do? But still, the saint relented. If such a beautiful student is asking for it, perhaps it would be a good choice. The saint asked Arya to give her hand. The girl didn't quite understand at first, but immediately realized everything. She held out her stump, and the saint immediately began to heal everything. Today, Arya will be this heroine's sword and shield. The woman told the mercenary not to forget it until the day of her demise, and inside just hoped she didn't pull the hero down. Arya felt that something was happening to her hand. She was healing, literally. Tears came to her eyes. Eventually, the hand was as good as new. Arya started to whimper, and Saint asked what I would do. The girl immediately apologized, but the feeling overwhelmed her. Smiling Saint ordered her to immediately go to her hero Yubara. In the woman I could sense some fatigue. Turning to the prince, Saint said they were lost too much time for this pointless argument. Meanwhile, the mercenary bowed. It was time to settle down. The prince agreed, though with great displeasure the man still didn't like having his lesson interrupted. Everyone else wished Hanu good luck and went about their business, and the guy remained sitting on his knees in the same pose. The prince paused for a second and looked at the failed lone hero, who had deflated so quickly in the shower, felt kind of bad. Meanwhile, Hanu, who had lost all hope, cursed all around the guy, screamed he felt like nothing. Suddenly heard the voice of the princess. She reached out her hand to the hero and told him to raise his head. Guy at first did not understand anything. The princess smiled and stood in front of him. She said that the boy was not wrong, but Hanu did not understand anything. Athena joyfully said that Hanu was the first to bring Arya to the temple, and the girl thanked him for saving her childhood friend. Hero. At first, he didn't realize what he was being thanked for. He just looked up and looked at the princess. The princess gently took the boy's hand, and he felt a warmth in his whole body, which was pleasantly spreading. After looking at the boy even more closely, the princess smiled and asked him to become her second apprentice, a bright pink light spilling everywhere. Hanu felt an unexpected lightness and warmth appearing. He had gained a new ability of magic. The second apprentice sounded like a real title and just looked at the princess. Smiling, the princess bowed and wished the hero all the best, and now she bade adieu to her business. With a quick step, the girl caught up with the prince and went on, while the puzzled Hanu still stood there, not understanding anything. But suddenly, he had a thought so stupid it's impossible to imagine a worse one. He thought the princess was in love with him. The gods were shocked. The guy, meanwhile, was jubilant with happiness. Good, now it's time to start again. He put his hands up and prepared to conquer the world again. Meanwhile, several large orcs tried to deal with their opponent, but it was all to no avail. They were practically powerless. One of the orcs tried to offer conversation, but was immediately hit hard in the jaw and lost several teeth. Khan handled his opponent with incredible ease. Another day and another mob to fight him. Well, here's the result. Unlike werewolves, these guys don't call others for help, but there's no place to hide. And there was something else. The hero was standing on the ground, and looking around, something seemed strange to him about it all. There was silence all around, and only a small sheep bleeding somewhere nearby. Turning the other way, the guy saw that the sheep was trying to eat the saddle that was on the cow. These things stood out too much. The player tried to take a piece of his cloak from the sheep and shoved the demon's clothes into it. By the way, the demon also came back to life. Yes, he was alive and asked to be released because he had recovered. Kang was surprised to find that the demon could hide its horns, but it was just deceptive magic. Most explained that he didn't hide them from the beginning because it makes it harder to regenerate. Besides, it would look weird. When the demon saw the sheep chewing on his cloak, it freaked out at what it was all about. Meanwhile, Khan was confused, hoping that Mos was smarter than the werewolf. But he said it was the nearest town, and they ended up in some steppe. I wonder how far away that town is. Suddenly there was a rumbling sound, and someone's cursing. A wagon approached them at a great speed. A frightened man was sitting there, and voices were heard. Orcs chased the wagon and tried to rob it. They laughed and demanded to give them everything. The man in the wagon was furious. There were several guards around. They were trying to deal with the attacking orcs, but it was all but useless. The coachman was also screaming. The leader of the orcs slung his huge sword on his shoulder and asked angrily how these piglets dared to fight them. For a few seconds, the hero stood still and pondered for a moment. Then the voice of the demon was heard, asking if they could manage without his help. Looking at him, Kang said that even if Moss was a demon, he didn't have to marry an elderly lordess, but the demon only snapped his teeth, which pissed him off. The player offered to see if he could get revenge a little later on, which the demon called him heartless. Perhaps it is true, but cannot be believed. The caravan stopped. The orcs rejoiced. These humans were finally tired, and now they would give them everything they had. Screams could be heard everywhere. Several guards jumped out of the wagon and immediately readied their weapons to protect His Majesty. The orcs sniffed and smelled the scent of a woman. It gave them a new impetus. Just need to grab the food better to ignore them and leave. Two women came out of the cart, one with brown hair and the other wearing some sort of cape with purple bangs. The orcs kept laughing and saying that the piglets had better stay where they were, but the girls were closing in on them. The one with purple hair was a mage. She launched a huge fireball at them to finally deal with the pesky monsters. The one with the sword rushed forward swinging her blade, and it turned out they were not bad fighters. Suddenly, the swordswoman's blade caught fire, and she jumped at one of the orcs with a scream. The monster didn't even have time to realize what had happened. The rest of the guards tried to bring themselves to their senses and watched from the sidelines, men laughing and happy to be saved. Kang, along with the demon, were also watching from the side. The player thought that this girl was pretty strong, if she could do such a thing. He didn't like it, the demon asked. Isn't the guy happy that innocent people are trying to survive? Of course not. The player said he regretted missing the opportunity to get revenge on them, but the demon noticed it was the same thing. Watching all this beating, Kang thought the girls looked like the elite friendship with such strong people can make life easier. Suddenly, the guy breathed in a full chest of air to scream, his cheeks puffed up like a hamster's. Opening his mouth, Kang shouted that there was a very beautiful pig girl here. He tried to attract the attention of the orcs. Thanks to the curse, the humans won't understand his words, but the orcs yes, the demon is terrified of what he's doing, why he's attracting the orcs. Smiling, Kang replied that he was just collecting the status of the pigs, not to mention that danger is fun, needing to solve everything at once. The sorceress was already preparing her next magical strike. The girl stopped for a second and looked in the direction of the voice. The swordswoman swung her blade to strike again, but stopped for a second and looked away in surprise. The orcs continued to approach them and shouted that the pig girls belonged to them. A small altercation ensued between them. Seeing the rest of the monsters, the people were frightened. They started to look around at each other and squeezed their eyes shut. The sorceress, who was preparing another blow, stopped and looked in the direction from where the stomping of hooves was heard. The orcs froze in place. And then Mos froze in place. He wondered if his companion had used the curse to summon as many orcs as possible. With a smile on his face, the player drew his sword, and now they would help these beautiful ladies. Did the demon want this? However, a certain god, an outsider, offers to leave these women. Kang asked to understand him this time. He can't do otherwise. The orcs gradually surrounded the wagons and shouted that the pig girls were tired. We should surround them and take them prisoner, then they would have fun. When she saw the orc leader, the girl with the sword looked around frightened. She was already tired, and her strength was running out. Standing in front of the orcs, Kang looked closely at the girls, who still looked pretty good. The orcs also stopped for a second. The leader took a closer look. He didn't understand what was wrong with this skinny pig. He was looking forward with red eyes. Looking at him with a joyful look, the player gleamed his eyes and said that he was just an apostle of God, outsider passing by, that's all. Lowering his head, the huge monster said that this scrawny pig looked quite fearless. Anger was boiling in the monster's eyes. Worth destroying this scrawny pig very quickly, and the orc brought his huge tasak down right on the hero's head. At the last moment, the guy jumped aside and even shrieked a little in surprise. The rest of the orcs also prepared themselves. All of these monsters had the same reaction. They were quite slow, so predicting their movements wasn't that hard. Turning to one of the orcs, Khan looked closer and saw his matching target. He stuck 2 fingers up the nose of one of the closer orcs and asked to borrow it for a bit. The player made one great leap and toppled the huge pig-like high-air monster. With just one throw, all the others froze in place. The girls saw it too, and were very much surprised they had seen someone so strong for the first time. Fear was evident on their faces. Kang looked at his fingers and realized that it was pretty cool, but it was disgusting that all his fingers had snot on them. A second later, something that looked like a blade swept before the boy's eyes. It was so fast that he only managed to get away at the last moment. Orcs continued to advance. They were somehow too many of them were heard shouting everywhere. They wanted to destroy the little piglet. Now the guy saw through their attacks, and defeating these monsters was only a matter of time, and there was plenty of time for his eyes to glisten. Suddenly, the voice of a frightened demon was heard, warning the player to be careful because someone was behind him. When he turned his head around, he really saw that he was being attacked by a huge ringleader, his eyes burning with rage and hatred. At the last second, Khan turned toward him and prepared to deliver a crushing blow. Standing in the distance, Mos was very frightened. Why did this guy let his guard down? This is, after all, a red orc. He is much stronger than the others. But from what happened in the next second, the girls opened their mouths in surprise, their faces filled with fright and bewilderment. The player sighed heavily. Did the demon really think that he could be hurt by such a thing? Even funny to hear Kang was alive and well? At some point, the demon realized that before him was a real monster and only sighed dejectedly. It was time to forget about it. Taking a closer look at the defeated monster, Kang realized that this orc had also turned red, something similar to the ability of werewolves. The guards were talking among themselves in their own language, and they were probably also very surprised and a little frightened. Quite nicely, they thanked the guy for saving him. Khan bathed in their gratitude. He was incredibly pleased. This may not be enough, but the player is already beginning to understand some words. After all, the demon's training has not gone unnoticed. Suddenly God appeared. He was uncomfortable with his ward's behavior. He suggested they honestly just destroy the guy, said bear with him. A few orcs began to sigh doom. The pig was very strong, but nothing, maybe he will get tired and defeating him will become much easier. But suddenly, something flew into the head of one of the orcs at the last second. The monster closed in. Lowering his eyes down, the orc saw that it was the hand of one of them, but the monster didn't realize anything. Getting a little closer to them, Khan asked which of the orcs could turn red. The monster replied by asking why this pig knew their language. A smile appeared on the player's face, and his eyes once again shone with an emerald red light. Soon, the other orcs were also lying unconscious, and some had left this world. The demon came closer and inquired about the player's health. Moss pointed his finger somewhere to the side and said, "To look there." Kang shifted his eyes to the side and opened his eyes in surprise. The people he had just rescued looked extremely puzzled, and the guards looked at him with disbelief as they defended their masters. Thinking about it, Kang realized that he seemed to have used too much werewolf power, then let the demon do something about it. Mos became indignant, but he didn't seem to have any other choice. Approaching the people, the demon explained that he was a mage, and the man next to him was his apprentice, Kang, who had come from far away. It's amazing how fast the demon made up that crap. And besides, people seem to believe him. So for now, there's no need to worry. The same girl with purple hair suddenly revived. She looked at the hero with grateful eyes and began to repeat something, repeating his name. Moss explained that just like he said on this person, hero's curse. But let them look closely, he also has the elf's blessing. Closing his lips, the hero thought about that very first kiss the elfess took away, so he works this way, it's pretty good. But immediately, Kang became angry. His eyes lit up red. Originally, it was all the fault of that cursed goddess. The enchantress approached him. The girl looked at the player with grateful eyes. The demon explained that she was ashamed for doubting her savior. The player scratched the back of his head in satisfaction and rejoiced that he had finally found a worthy guide, and the locals were beginning to trust him. Meanwhile, God was feeling as uncomfortable as possible and didn't like where this was going. After all, they're supposed to be outsiders. The ghost began to rage. He said that the most terrible fate awaits the traitorous outsider, and the guy himself realized that it was hard for him. Khan decided to make things clear. He asked God to calm down. Now he will explain something, after all. Ghost has come to his senses. Soon they made a small camp, and Kang sat by the fire to keep warm and talked to God about something. The ghost hummed something under his nose and said that being impotent is not a sin. Meanwhile, the player was in sorrow. He muttered that it was actually God's fault. This blessing has its plus side, which is also a minus. The point is that all statuses can return to normal. And it had been so long since he had done anything, Khan continued to sit by the fire and be sad. Someone came up to him. It was the same swordswoman girl. She looked at her savior and addressed him by name. The girl's name was Julia, at least the player thought, so she was a noble lady attending the famous local academy. It was difficult to communicate with her because the devil translator was already asleep. Kang looked towards his demon. Much to the hero's surprise, the girl has moved incredibly far away from him. Does she really want him to leave? Suddenly, Julia addressed him by name again, and Khan was very much surprised and at the same time frightened out of his thoughts. Suddenly, she took her dagger and lit it like a torch. The blade glowed with a blue light. Julia Based called the guy by name, and it seems the hero realized that she too wanted to be shown something similar. Good then, let him watch carefully, and Kang lit his 2 fingers with a red light. For several seconds, Julia sat silently staring at this incident without saying a word. Her eyes gradually widened. Suddenly, she jumped up to the player and scared him a lot. The guy didn't realize what was going on. Julia bounced back and started muttering something to herself, but the player didn't understand what was going on with her at all. Doesn't she like that? He flamed too small. A player decided to light his dagger. This could be so much better. However, Julia only looked away with a kind of sad, detached look and said something in her own language. Then the girl rose from her seat and went somewhere far away, and the player was left in complete bewilderment. He was still holding his little sword and showing what he could do. He looked in front of him and froze for a while, realizing that no one was listening to him. Still, the female heart is difficult to understand. The guy sighed heavily. God appeared in front of him and said that, "Impotent, it is better not to think about such things." At this time of the Royal Academy, Hanu was perplexed as to why this guard couldn't let him into the dormitory. He is also a hero, after all. The guard was saying he was a heroic loser, and afterward, Hannah felt a little twitchy about that. Healer. He turned to the boy and told him to choose one of the 3 options. Hanu raised an eyebrow in surprise. What other options? The priest explained that the first is to get the Independence Fund and surrender, in which case he can no longer be called a hero or will be executed. At the last word, Hanu turned green with fear. What does executed mean? That's crazy. The third option is to go back to training, but until he shows outstanding results, he'll be unsupported. But what's the third option? Third, it's to entrust his body to the temple to find a noble woman to marry, and then they'll take care of everything, but he can't leave the temple. After thinking about it, the guy decided to choose the first option. After all, he can't stay trapped. It's too much for him. In that case, the mage presented him with a small scroll and told him to sign something hero. At first, didn't understand what kind of signature. When Hanu found out it was a contract, he was a little confused. Why do they need a contract? There must be some kind of setup. However, the monk explained that it would be bad if the one who left the temple violated the reputation of the heroes. It would be a huge blow kind of insurance. Presenting him with a bag of gold coins and a precious ring, they said it was the Independence Fund and a new personality to replace the old hero. The boy's eyes lit up with excitement. He didn't quite understand what had happened. It was very different from what he had read in novels and short stories. The priest probably heard the guy talking and interjected. However, Hanu said it was just talking to himself. However, there were a few options. The guy asked, can he use this money as he wishes, but it was also, the priest smiled. After acquiring such wealth, Hanu decided to leave the temple. The marriage was certainly tempting, but it's not a good ending at all. The statue of the goddess towered above the rest of the temple, pointing straight up into the sky, where people often came to pray. Near the statue again sat the saint, and she was praying. A maid came to her and told her that the hero Hanu had abandoned his mission. Saint interjected, is it really so? She thought that the number of heroes from now on should decrease, but it would be problematic if it didn't. There are 2 saints on the continent of fantasy, and until the real fight starts, she should take care of everything. She said that when she visited the elf kingdom, she heard that the number of gnolls had decreased. The maid said it was a mystical order of knights. The saint didn't quite believe these words, and asked the maid if she was sure that the order of knights had dealt with all werewolves. However, the maid confirmed. They think it was an elite squad, practicing only one knowledge of knights. They must be underestimating these werewolves. There are a whole tribe of elves to exterminate them. Hearing the suggestion that perhaps it was the demon lord saint twitched. She hadn't heard that name in a long time. Realizing that she had blabbed a little too much, the maid apologized for her reservation and hurriedly covered her mouth with her hand. She felt a little scared. Turning toward her in a good-natured voice, the saint said that such sudden judgments can be very dangerous. However, it could be true, so it's worth checking it out. The maid bowed and said she would do her bidding. The saint stood looking after her for a few minutes longer, thinking of one place on the edge of the west. Demon Lord. And most of the kings are in the east. A few of them are active in the central region of the continent. Suddenly, a mage healer entered the room. He brought with him a divination orb and said it was a message from the academy. They say they'd like to invite students to celebrate the start of school vacation. Saint First, slightly confused about what they're talking about. Do they really know about the Heroes Challenge? Where did the information leak from? There was a look of concern on the woman's face. The old man replied that the student saw Hannah's status window in the mercenary guild. That's the whole result. Saint slapped herself in the face. It was a mistake to let him act freely. She had thought the guy would wear himself out and come back. Of course, it's good that the existence of the heroes is becoming known because they are the hope of mankind. But they are still too weak. After a little thought, Saint said for the man to tell them that they agreed. The old man nodded his head. He would contact them right away. The conversation was about to come to an end when suddenly an alarmed voice rang out, and a guard rushed into the room and called out to the saint. The man said he had a report to that effect. Even through his heavy helmet, you could hear his rapid breathing. They found a bag that supposedly belonged to the hero. The saint looked up with surprised eyes. A look of fear flashed across her face. Meanwhile, the carefree Kang was riding in a wagon with only the creak of unlubricated wheels everywhere, and the boy was thinking. Next to him sat a demon player, wondering if those girls had hired mercenaries. The demon muttered, "Isn't it obvious?" One of the guards wondered why Kang was so powerful since he was only level 1 and how he trained. The hero only snorted at how shallow this superficial demon asked, "Should he translate that, as I am uncomfortable with your degenerate greed?" Immediately the player was alarmed. No, of course, he does not want to ruin the relationship on the first day. However, the demon said that the guy should not hold back. Looking at his companion, Kang asked if it was normal for a mercenary to be a bit shameless and rude. Mos replied that he didn't say that everything depends on the situation. Quite often, all mercenaries go to the other world because of quarrels. Surprised, the player asked, then why do they continue to work in such conditions? It is dangerous and uncomfortable. Sighing heavily with some sadness, the demon replied that if you receive the blessing of a mercenary, you can get experience for completing tasks. Those words made the player think of the experience. It sounded pretty interesting. Wait a minute. Looking at the status window, Khan opened his mouth. It's not that experience penalty that stunts growth, only affects hunting and achievements, but has no effect on the other. Seeing his companion's concern, the demon asked if something was wrong. He was about to fall asleep. Suddenly, the player grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him towards him. The demon was very scared that this had happened to his companion. Kang looked like he'd lost his mind. The guy was breathing heavily and had heat coming from him. The boy's face became insane. He asked in a furious voice what he had to do to become a mercenary. It seems there is a way to become stronger. After a few hours, the mood of the hero significantly improved. On his face appeared a smile, and his eyes shone with happiness. They had finally arrived in town, and things should be getting better. It was quite crowded, and the town looked quite ordinary. And it smelled of rotten stench, too. Kang grimaced in disgust as the demon grumbled something to himself. A lot of people gathered at the entrance to the city. Yes, and it's not easy to wash while traveling, but suddenly their eyes were caught on something. The demon said that after bathing in orc blood, the hero himself smells worse than the rest of Khan sniffed at his clothes, and it's true. The hero began to sneer. He couldn't believe that Moss could mock someone so easily. Moss shouted that it wasn't Kanu's place to talk about it. Turning back, the player noticed that the mercenaries had disappeared. As soon as they entered the city, the demon asked, did he like them or what? There was no need to pine for these people. They had their own itinerary, guild bars, inns, stables, and forges. Meanwhile, the player was rubbing up against the food stall. The guy sniffed the fruit the whole time he heard, "Only meat and pig demon," wondered, "This man does not feel hunger after all." Looking to the side, Mo suggested that they seemed to need to hear about the matter their lady had asked for with a stuffed mouth. The player confirmed that the demon was right. Speaking of girls, Julia and her companion stood nearby and watched the guys from the sidelines. Looking at the player, the demon said they wanted to repay for saving a life, so they offered to settle in one permanent courtyard. Khan was fine with that. And the god kept nagging that it's not good. The guy asked him to be a little more gentle with the impotent man. After all, his life is not so good. So the first thing they need to do is go to the mercenary guild. Most advised Kanu to wash up first, if he didn't want to be thrown out at the door. Sniffing himself, Kang could indeed smell a foul odor. Even the deity cringed in disgust. There was a rather strange laundry room here. The role of washing machine was performed by the usual slugs. They ate the dirt off the clothes. The player sat in front of them and marveled these things are pretty useful, and Kanu was starting to like this cute slime more and more. But the demon kept grumbling. He said trained slime is very expensive, so don't even think about stealing it. Putting on the already clean clothes, the player asked how expensive they were, literally worth their weight in gold, or as the slime continued to lick the sweater. Tickling a small lump of blue slime with his finger, Kang said he couldn't believe being so expensive. It made her even cuter. Continuing to grumble, Mouse told Kanu to hurry up and change. But the hero asked if the demon had said they would go to the shop later, since there were no spare clothes. The demon only snorted. Gentlemen have to show up early and wait for the lady, so Maz bought something for such an occasion. Realizing that he still had no fidgeting, the player only quacked and stuck his tongue out in frustration. They started joking around about getting married again. Soon the boys were already standing in the inn. There were quite a few people, many of whom were of noble birth, and voices were heard everywhere. Standing near the entrance, Kang grumbled to himself as he was forced to change into some clown clothes, which was very annoying. Meanwhile, somewhere off to the side, Moss was making real small talk with a few young ladies, and they were laughing all the time, which made me sick. Raising an eyebrow, the hero wondered, this demon communicates with humans, although it looks at them like animals. God also looked there with annoyance. And now the ladies were here. All the others had also turned their attention away from their business and looked before them with surprised and delighted looks. The girls came down the stairs from Julia, waving a small hand to the guests in greeting. They were talking about something in their own language, but the words were still unknown. The demons spoke to them like a native tongue, and the player standing behind them did not understand anything at all. God felt increasingly uncomfortable. Honestly, Kanu didn't care. It was better to offer to eat something tasty or his stomach would be rumbling from the morning. Smiling broadly in an incredibly polite tone, the demon said that he knew a good restaurant nearby that would be to ladies' liking. The girls most likely addressed the hero since his name kept popping up there. Turning to his partner, the demon vehemently said that they approve of Kana's idea. They want to go first, where he wants to go. Smiling, the guy said that he agreed. So let the demon hand over at this time. Mose was cursing the whole world and was not paying any attention to him at all. Kang rejoiced. These citizens of the fantasy world are good. But God stood behind his back with a completely furious expression on his face. He was furious. Being in a different place. Hanu just stood and looked up in front of him, wide open eyes. The guy was shocked by something. He was in the slave market, and why everything here was so expensive, his money was barely enough, and absolutely all of it. Suddenly, someone's words were heard. A woman spoke. The player looked in the direction from where the voice came and opened his eyes. Girls dressed in fine noblemen's clothes stood near a huge, muscular man handcuffed and admired his body. They begged him to say something, but the man just stood there staring in front of him with a completely detached look. He was miserable. Another slave owner was yelling at his prey, two men of frail build, probably bad slaves. The man was beating the fuck out of them and saying these guys would be sent to re-education. This man was a terrible host. Looking that way, Hanu shivered a bit still. What kind of animals these people in the gods, meanwhile, were up to some guy. Without finding anything he liked, the player walked around the area and looked around. His gaze fell on the very skinny slave guy. He stared helplessly in front of him. And then he looked at the same girl. The look they had was pathetic. Suddenly heard, "Whose is that familiar voice?" Hanu looked in front of him with surprised eyes. The voice said to himself, "Familiar," but the guy couldn't understand who it was at all. In front of him stood two muscular men with a beard. and another guy dressed in a neat suit with gray eyes and hair. Who this big guy was unknown. The man had a detached look. He looked as if through everyone seemed to have no sanity. Meanwhile, the arrogant guy said that they seemed to have the same thoughts, not to arrange the training, and they took the money and left. Hanu tried to guffaw and said it was a secret, but this guy doesn't even know that he bailed on his first day out of this academy. However, this man was not going to be so easy to peel off. He patted the hero on the shoulder and said that he needed to relax, need to get along while not in the same boat. Hearing about the useful information, Hanu was wary. Apparently, he was a slippery type who was dangerous to trust. Looking behind him, the guy with gray hair said that the man who sits at the table is in charge, and if he finds out about the hero, he will offer the best slaves. The former student was ready to hear a sharp rejection, but if you don't show your status window, actually the contract will not be broken. When he saw that the conversation was not going well, the merchant asked, in any case, what kind of slave Hanu was looking for, but the guy was not going to share the information. The hero just passed by and went somewhere far away, but an old acquaintance said, let him come to the permanent yard if he wants to show off. In the meantime, the two remained where they were, and the master wondered why this guy was so cautious. The man in charge of selling slaves heard the voice of the buyer and said that he was busy right now, so later he had a tube in his mouth. However, Hanu was not going to back down so easily. He slammed his hands on the table, then scared the merchant. The guy said he was going to buy slaves. The player looked at the merchant with a fierce look, somehow from top to bottom, and showed his profile. Seeing that the hero stands before him, the merchant immediately changed on his face, stretched a smile, he lost his hands, and greeted the hero. Showing the paper, the man asked in a sweet voice what kind of slave the hero wished to buy, perhaps a strong fighter for battles. Inside himself, the fatty was rejoicing. This beggar used to have a lot of money. Today seems to be a lucky day, and he will be golden. As Hanu approached the fat salesman, he said he needed to buy a strong warrior, and the man smiled, or maybe they didn't have one after all. But the merchant went to the sturdy cast-iron door and said that just for such occasions they had one slave and invited the lad to go inside. As soon as they entered the fortress, they saw many other slaves. Walking up to one of his challengers, the merchant pointed his hand at him and offered this option to a rather strong slave. With eyes full of hope, Hanu looked at the offered goods and was horrified. In front of him stood a true monster, a huge woman from the outside. You could have mistaken her for a man, but she was a thief of the northern regions. At that moment, all the lad's hopes crumbled. He came to dread not so certainly Hanu's self had envisioned a strong woman. The merchant said that this woman demonstrates simply monstrous strength, can lift a two-handed axe with one hand in order to show her status window to the client. The woman revealed her characteristics. She had a high level and monstrous strength. Her name was Marasi. She looked at the young man with disdain. Seeing the confusion on the buyer's face, the seller tried to reassure him not to worry about the price. He was not going to profit from the hero. Scratching the back of his head, Hanu shyly said that he wanted a strong yet slender woman. The salesman smirked again. A sly smile began to spread on his face, and his eyes squinted. As this man has the blessing of magic, doesn't he need a shield? Spreading his hands, the guy said that the merchant was not wrong, but could Hanu choose his own slave, it would be easier. The fat man kept smiling and invited the customer to go forward and choose what suited him best. To the merchant's surprise, the customer returned incredibly quickly. The man turned around to the side. In front of him stood the same kid, and next to him 3 women who looked very young, but at the same time beautiful. Hanu was smiling. The first girl with red hair had the name Lusa. In fact, these slender girls are much stronger than the hero himself. The others' names were Sarah and Kana. The merchant came to them and looked at them with a scornful look. The girls straightened up. The man lit 2 lights in his hands and said that from now on the hero Hanu was their new owner. The man's face was smiling, and he was already anticipating a big reward. With a smile on his face, the man said he destroyed the contract, transferred ownership, let him give clear orders. It happens that slaves destroy owners. The fellow readily handed the merchant a weighty bag of coins as payment jingled. With a wink to his new friends, Hanu told them to follow him. First, we need to buy them some weapons. All the slave girls agreed with their new master with one voice, although it was obvious from their faces that they were not particularly pleased. And at the same time, their new master was just burning with impatience. The rest of the gods were just watching that I was popcorn. Being in the mercenary guild, Kang meanwhile was furious. Eating and coming to the mercenary guild went just fine. But the main problem was that he didn't know the local language and couldn't just sign a contract. It seems he should have learned at least a few letters. Raising his eyes, the guy saw a pretty girl. She was a registrar and was eagerly looking at the new mercenary. The unhappy hero was ready to cry. At the same place, no one could sign for him. It seemed that the meaning of life was lost. A joyful moss appeared from behind him. He smiled. No need to be upset. Some mercenaries can't write. Now it was his turn to nitpick. He slid a small sheet of paper with a few symbols written on it to the boy and told him to copy it as if it were easy. After a good dozen minutes, the hero still managed to sign the contract. Although it cost him a lot of effort, finally, he was able to